Hey there, and welcome back. If you are settling in now, the lamps turned low, the day finally loosening its grip on your shoulders, then you have come to the right place. Tonight we are going somewhere that does not exist anymore, existing only in memory, and we are going to stay there together for a few unhurried hours. Tonight we are walking into 18th century France, into the candlelit corridors of Versailles, into the life of a woman all of Europe argued about while she lived and has gone on arguing about ever since. Let your breathing ease. Let the room around you go still. Nothing is asked of you in what follows but to listen. By the time we reach the end of her life, you will have watched a girl from a Paris counting house become the most powerful woman in France without ever holding a single office the law recognized, and you will have watched a king stand at a window in the rain, unable to look away from a carriage leaving without him. Before we go in, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight and what the hour is where you are, whether it is late evening or the small hours, whether there is rain on your window or only the dark beyond it. Leave it below if you feel like it, because I do read what you write, and there is something companionable in knowing the places these stories travel to. If these long evenings of history are something you would like to find your way back to, you are welcome to subscribe, and then the next one will come and find you. This is all. No urgency, nothing to do. Just settle in and let me take you back. Now, picture a tall, narrow house in Paris, in the last dark days of the year 1721. The streets below the windows are slick with December rain, the kind that does not so much fall as hang in the air and settle on everything, on the slate roofs and the iron lamp brackets and the shoulders of the few people abroad after dusk. Behind a shuttered casement a fire is burning down in a small grate, and a woman has just given birth to a daughter, and the city does not notice, because the city has no reason to. The child has been baptized Jeanne Antoinette Poisson. Poisson means fish, and it is exactly the sort of name the old families of France would one day find very funny, in their cruel way, when this same infant grew up to outshine all of them. But that is a long way off. For now there is only a baby in a plain warm room, a tired mother, the smell of wood smoke and tallow, and the rain on the shutters. Come closer. This is where it begins. The family into which she had arrived was comfortable and faintly disreputable, which is a far more interesting place to begin a life than either grandeur or poverty. Let the night of her birth settle around you for a moment before we go on, because it is the only quiet she would ever be allowed. December in Paris, the river running high and grey under its bridges, the rain coming down on the steep slate roofs and the crowded streets, and the 1,000 chimneys breathing wood smoke into the dark. Inside the tall, narrow house, a fire burning low, a midwife's murmur, the particular hush that falls over a household in the hours after a child is safely come. No bells rang for her. No heralds carried word through the city. She was one more infant born to one more Paris family of the middling sort, and not a soul beyond those walls marked the date or thought it mattered, and there was no reason on earth they should have. The most extraordinary fact about the beginning of this extraordinary life is how perfectly ordinary it was. A baby and a tired mother and the rain, the same scene playing out behind 100 other shuttered windows across the sleeping city that same wet night. Call it ordinariness in your mind as we go forward, because everything that follows is the story of how far one human being can travel from a beginning exactly like everyone else's, and of what the travelling costs. Her father, Francois Poisson, was a man who handled other people's money, a supplier and a speculator of the kind the old aristocracy depended upon and despised in the same breath. He bought grain and sold it. He financed and provisioned. He moved in the murky and necessary sphere of the men who kept the vast machine of the state supplied, while the nobles who used them held their noses. When Jeanne was 4 years old, A scandal over the price of grain in a time of shortage closed over her father's head, and he fled France altogether with a sentence of death hanging behind him, and for several years the household carried on without him as best it could. The mother, Louise Madeleine, was beautiful and clever, and not, by the standards of respectable Paris, entirely careful of her reputation, and into the gap her absent husband had left there stepped a wealthy financier named Lenormand de Tournehem. He was a man of fortune and cultivation, a tax farmer grown rich on the revenues of the crown, and he took an interest in the abandoned family that the gossips of the day found very easy to explain. He took an interest above all in the bright little girl. Whether he was her natural father, as half of Paris would later whisper behind its fan, or simply a generous protector with a soft spot for a clever child, no one has ever been able to prove, and it hardly changes the shape of what followed. What matters is that this rich and discerning man looked at Jeanne Antoinette and saw something worth a fortune, and he had the money to spend, and he spent it on her with the deliberate patience of a man cultivating a rare plant he intends, one day, to see flower. The household she grew up in deserves a moment of your attention, because it was neither one thing nor the other, and that in-between quality marked her for life. They were not poor. With Tournehem's fortune behind them, they lived well, with good furniture and good food and the proper appearances. But they were not respectable in the way the age then meant the word, not noble, not even securely of the solid professional classes, but financiers and speculators, people of money rather than of blood, with a fugitive father and a mother whose name was spoken with a raised eyebrow. The Paris around them was a city of hard contrasts, of immense wealth and open sewers running together, of gilded carriages splashing through filth, of grand families a few streets from desperate want, all of it crowded and noisy and reeking and alive. And in the middle of it grew a clever, watchful girl who learned early the most useful lesson her origins could teach her, which was that the lines society drew between people were not laws of nature, but only arrangements, and that a person of sufficient gifts and sufficient nerve might, just possibly, be able to step across them. She was born on the wrong side of each line that mattered in her century. She would spend her life proving that the lines could be crossed. And then there is the story of the fortune teller, which you should hear now, even though you may decide, as I sometimes do, that it was polished up after the fact to fit the destiny it foretold. When Jeanne was 9 years old, her mother took her across the city to a woman in the Rue de la Hachette, who had a reputation for reading what was to come, a Madame de Pompadour. Imagine the two of them climbing a dim stair, the mother's hopes wound tight, the child solemn and watchful as clever children are, into a low room smelling of candle smoke and dried herbs. And the woman took the girl's small hand and her measure, and said the words the household would never afterwards forget. She said the child would one day reign over the heart of a king, not over a kingdom, you understand, not as a crowned queen, over the heart of a king, which is a far stranger and more precarious gift to be promised, a throne with no walls and no guarantees, held only as long as one heart goes on choosing you. Sit with the strangeness of that promise, because the shape of her life is hidden inside it. A queen once crowned is a queen for as long as she lives, secure in law and ceremony whatever her husband feels for her, as the gentle wronged queen of this very story would prove. But to reign over a heart is to hold a throne that can be lost in an afternoon, that rests on nothing but the continuing choice of another person, that must be won again and again and again, day after day, for as long as it is to be kept. It is the most insecure sovereignty imaginable, and it was the only kind this girl was ever offered. No wonder she became what she became, a woman who could never rest, never assume, never take a single day's loyalty for granted, because the prophecy that shaped her had told her, in effect, that her power would always be provisional, always one cooling glance away from nothing. The fortune-teller, if she said any such thing at all, had described not a triumph but a sentence, and the family that heard it as a blessing had perhaps not understood what they were wishing on the child. To reign over a heart is to spend your life afraid of losing it. She would learn that lesson young, and never afterward unlearn it. The mother believed it absolutely. From that day the girl had a private name within the family, a name they used among themselves the way you might shelter a small flame with a cupped hand. They called her Reinette, Little Queen, and it was no idle endearment, because each lesson the child was given from that hour forward, each accomplishment poured into her at vast expense, was poured in with the prophecy in mind. The household had, in effect, decided to make the fortune-teller's words come true by force of preparation, if fate proved too slow to manage it alone. They would build the little queen a kingdom of skills so complete that when her king finally appeared, whoever he was, she would be ready for him down to her fingertips. I want you to sit with that for a moment before we move on, because it tells you nearly everything about how this life was shaped and about the strange weight a child can be made to carry. Here was a girl raised, deliberately and from the cradle, to be extraordinary, not, so far as anyone troubled to record, for her own happiness, which nobody seems to have given much thought to at all, but through a destiny spoken over her in a fortune-teller's room before she was 10 years old. She grew up knowing that much was expected of her, and that the expectation had a shape, the shape of a man she had never met, and a court she had never seen. That is the foundation everything else is built upon, the prophecy and the preparation and the family that loved her precisely, insofar as she could be made remarkable. And we are going to build on it now, lesson by lesson, exactly as they did. So consider what it actually cost, in years and effort and money, to manufacture a perfect woman in the France of the 1730s, because Tournehem paid for all of it and spared nothing. First the girl was sent away for a while to a convent of Ursuline nuns at Poissy, a little upriver from the city, to acquire the polish and the piety that respectable young women were expected to carry like a dowry of the soul. Picture her there, a small bright presence among the cool stone cloisters and the smell of cold incense, learning her catechism and her needlework and the careful downcast manners of a well-bred girl, and being, by all accounts, rather often unwell, because her health was delicate from the very beginning, and would stay delicate all her life. The nuns found her enchanting. People always did. And then, her health drawing her home again, the real education began, the kind that money rather than birth alone could purchase, and it was lavished on her by the best masters in France. She learned to sing, and she sang beautifully with a clear, true voice that could fill a room and hold it. She was set at the harpsichord and the clavichord, and taught to play not merely correctly, but with feeling, so that the instrument seemed to be saying something. She was given over to a dancing master who taught at the opera, and she learned to move across a floor in a way that made the eye want to follow her, each turn and curtsy schooled until the schooling vanished and only the grace remained. She studied drawing and engraving, the discipline of the hand and the trained eye, and she was good enough that one of the finest painters in all of France, François Boucher, took her seriously as a pupil rather than as a rich man's pretty amusement. Imagine those hours in the studio, the light coming grey, and even from the north, the smell of linseed oil and ground pigment thick in the air, the great painter leaning over the shoulder of a girl in her teens, and finding to his surprise that she truly saw, that she understood what she was looking at and how it might be set down, that eye she would never lose, and it would one day reshape the taste of a nation. Picture the ordinary shape of one of those days, because the glamour of the result hides the grind that made it. A morning at the harpsichord, the same passage played until the master stopped wincing, the dancing master arriving in the afternoon, and the patient, brutal repetition of a single entrance, a single turn, a single curtsy, held and held until the body learned to do it without the mind, because grace that has to be thought about is not yet grace. Then perhaps a page of verse to be learned and spoken, not gabbled, but shaped, each pause weighed. Then a scene from a play, in which she must weep or rage or fall in love on command, and convincingly before an audience of one severe instructor whose business was to catch the false note. It is a strange education to give a child, when you set it out plainly, an education in seeming, in the management of the surface, a person presents to others. But it was the most useful education anyone in that century could have devised for the life she was about to lead, because the life she was about to lead would be, from beginning to end, a performance held without interval before the most pitiless audience on earth, and she would never once, in all her years, be allowed to drop the part. She learned to recite poetry, holding a verse, so that its sense and music both came through, and she learned to act in private theatricals, and acting, it turned out, was perhaps her truest gift of all. To act well is to become, for a moment and completely, whatever a scene requires, and to make the becoming look like nature. It is a kind of intelligence, as much as a talent, the reading of what a moment needs, and the supplying of it without apparent effort. And she had it to a degree that frightened her rivals later, because it meant they could never be quite sure when she was performing and when she was not. She read widely, too, far more widely than a girl of her station was thought to need, history and philosophy, and the new ideas fermenting in the salons, and she could hold the thread of a serious conversation with men far older and more learned than herself, and leave them feeling they had never in their lives been listened to so well. And running underneath all of it, harder to teach than any single accomplishment and rarer than all of them together, was charm. Not prettiness, though she was very pretty, with fair colouring and large, bright, intelligent eyes and a figure that dress flattered. Charm is another thing entirely. It is the art of making another person feel, simply by being in your company, more interesting and more alive than they feel anywhere else. And it cannot really be drilled into a child, and yet somehow she had it in abundance. People who met her as a young woman came away dazzled, and could not always say precisely why. She gave them all of her attention. She remembered what they cared about, and asked after it. She laughed at the right moment, and grew serious at the right moment, and was, apparently, never bored and never boring, and a person who can give you that, hour after hour, becomes very quickly someone you do not want to be parted from. Sit with how unusual this was, because it is easy to picture a pampered girl and miss the iron discipline beneath the silk. Everything you have just heard represents thousands of patient hours, undertaken by a child who understood, far too young, that she was being shaped into an instrument for a purpose. By the time she came to womanhood, she was one of the most accomplished young women in France, and she was not noble, not in the smallest degree, and there was the hinge on which her life would turn. In an age where birth was supposed to be everything, here was a girl built to be better than the people born above her, and there was nowhere in the ordered universe of the old regime for such a creature to fit. They had made a queen and given her no kingdom to reign in. It was, when you stop to consider it, a genuine predicament, and a cruel one. The apparatus of the old regime rested on the principle that a person's place was fixed at birth and could not be earned or escaped, that a noble was a noble and a commoner as surely as an oak was an oak and an ash. A clever commoner was expected to be useful within his station, a good lawyer or sharp financier, and to know that station and keep to it. But here was a commoner made not merely clever, but accomplished beyond nearly anyone of noble birth, polished, cultivated, charming, fit by any measure except the one that mattered to grace the very highest company in the land, and barred from that company by an accident of blood she could do nothing to change. There was no honest path for such a person. She could not marry into the nobility, not really, not at the heights her gifts deserved. She could not hold office or command, or any of the things her abilities fitted her for. Her century had built her into a key for a lock it refused to let her near, and so when the one improbable door did at last crack open, the door of a king's regard, is it any wonder she went through it without hesitation, and held it open with both hands against everyone who tried to slam it shut? It was the only door there was. So they did the next best thing they could devise, which brings us to the matter of a husband, and to a house at the edge of a forest, where, if you knew exactly where to stand, you could sometimes watch a king ride by. In the year 1741, when she was 19, Jeanne Antoinette Poisson was married. The man chosen for her was Charles Guillaume Lenormant d'Etioles, the nephew of her benefactor Tournehem, and the match was, in the cold accounting of such things, a way of settling a costly heap of accomplishment into a respectable frame. He was no aristocrat either, but he was rich. His uncle's fortune would one day flow to him, and by the standards of arranged matches, he was no bad outcome for a young woman with no title to her name and a father living in exile under sentence of death. What nobody had quite reckoned on was that the young husband would fall headlong in love with his wife to the point of helpless devotion. He adored her, he told his friends, in the careless happiness of a man who cannot imagine his luck running out, that the only woman on earth who could ever tempt him to stray from his wife was the king himself, and he meant it as a compliment and a joke. You can feel, can you not, the cold little irony already waiting, coiled inside that sentence? For of course it was precisely the king who would take her, and the poor man had named his own undoing in the language of a fond joke, the way people so often do, blurting out the exact shape of the disaster they cannot imagine ever befalling them. He could not conceive of losing her. Why would he? He had won her fairly, married her properly, given her a good life, and she had given him, by all accounts, real affection in those early years, and a daughter, and the comfortable happiness of a man who believes his fortune settled. He had no way of knowing that he had married a woman a fortune-teller had marked for a throne, that her education had been a sustained preparation for a destiny that had nothing to do with him, that the contented country wife pouring his coffee was a loaded weapon waiting only for the right target to appear in the right forest. He thought he had married a person. He had married a destiny, and destinies do not stay in country houses. The joke was on him, and it was not funny, and he would not laugh again about the king for a very long time. For a few years she was Madame d'Etioles, mistress of a handsome country estate, and of a fine apartment in Paris, and she set about doing the very thing she had been trained for all her life, which was to gather brilliant people around her and shine in the centre of them. She kept a salon. Through her drawing-room came the wits and the writers and the thinkers of the age, and among them the most celebrated man of letters in Europe, Voltaire himself, who fell a little in love with her as nearly everyone did, and remained her admirer and ally to the end of her days. Let yourself sit in one of those evenings for a moment. The supper cleared away, the candles burning steady in their branches, a circle of clever, vain, delightful people arranged around a young woman who could sing for them, and then dispute philosophy with them, and then make them laugh until the tears came, and who contrived, somehow, to make each one of them feel, riding home in the carriage afterward through the dark streets, that they had been the very person she most wished to talk to. She was building something in those rooms, though she may not yet have known its full purpose. She was perfecting, on a small and forgiving stage, the exact art she would one day need to practice on the largest and most dangerous stage in France. Let me hold you in one of those evenings a moment longer, because it is the rehearsal for everything that follows. The room is warm with too many candles and too many people. A fire crackles in the grate, and the long windows are black with the night beyond. Someone has brought a new poem, and Voltaire, who is the cleverest and most dangerous tongue in Europe, and who is, that evening, entirely at her command, reads it aloud, and the room hangs on him, and then turns as one to see what she will make of it. And she makes something of it deftly, a remark that is both flattering and shrewd, that lets the poet feel admired, and the rest feel they have witnessed real judgment, and the talk leaps onward, brighter for her touch. Later she goes to the harpsichord, and the chatter falls away, and she sings, and you can watch the company forget, for the length of a song, to be vain and watchful and ambitious, and simply listen. This is what she does. She takes a roomful of clever, restless, self-regarding people, and she makes them for a few hours happy, and she makes them feel that the happiness came from her, and she sends them home half in love with an evening they cannot quite reconstruct in the cold light of morning. A king, she will discover, is only a roomful of restless self-regard concentrated into a single tired and powerful man, and the art is exactly the same, only the stakes are infinitely higher. But the estate at Étiolles had a feature that turns out to matter more than any salon, and it was simply where it stood. It sat at the edge of the forest of Senart, a royal hunting ground south of Paris, and the King of France hunted at Senart. Louis XV was a man in his middle 30s by now, the great-grandson of the Sun King, who had come to the throne as a small child and grown into a tall, dark, strikingly handsome man with a streak of deep melancholy running through him. He was easily bored and easily wearied, married since boyhood to a pious and devoted Polish princess some years older than himself, Marie Leszczyńska, who had borne him a clutch of children and lost his interest somewhere along the way. The mistresses his court arranged for him came and went like ministers, and he moved among them with the listless appetite of a man who has everything and wants none of it. When such a king rode out to hunt, the local gentry and country people were permitted, by old custom, to come and watch the hunt go by. And a young woman who lived at the forest's edge, who had been told since the age of 9 that she would reign over the heart of a king, was not about to leave her single chance to the courtesy of fate. So she arranged to be seen, and this is the part of the story her enemies would later tell as vulgar scheming and her admirers as romantic destiny, the truth sitting, as it usually does, somewhere in between. She had a light open carriage, a phaeton, and she had it turned out to be noticed, and on the days the king hunted she drove it along the forest rides, dressed in rose pink one day and pale sky blue the next, so that she became a sight the king's eye began without quite deciding to look for. A flash of colour at the tree line. A beautiful young woman who was always, somehow, exactly where the hunt could see her, and who never appeared to be trying, which is the very hardest illusion to maintain when you are in fact trying with all the force you possess. Let yourself stand for a moment at the edge of that forest on a hunting morning, because it is a scene worth inhabiting. The autumn air cold and clean, the great trees of Senart going copper and gold overhead, the ground soft with fallen leaves and loud suddenly, with the music of the chase, the horns calling far off and then nearer, the baying of the hounds, the drumming of hooves coming up through the soles of your feet before you see anything at all. And then the hunt, bursting out of the wood, the horses steaming, the riders in their hunting greens and the king somewhere among them, tall and dark, and for once nearly happy, because the hunt was one of the few things that quieted the grey weight in him. and there, drawn up at the edge of the ride where the road bent, and the king could not help but pass close, a light open carriage, and in it a young woman in rose pink, or the next time in palest blue, doing nothing at all, but being there, being lovely, being exactly the kind of thing a melancholy king might carry home in his mind's eye through a long evening at his palace. She never waved, never called out, never did anything so vulgar as to seem to want him. She simply arranged to be a picture he could not stop seeing. It was patience as a kind of seduction, and it worked the way patience so often does, slowly, and then all at once. The king noticed her. On one occasion he sent her a gift of game from the day's hunt, a gesture anyone at that court could read like a printed word, and she sent back by the same messenger her thanks, and the small dangerous correspondence of glances had begun. But reigning mistress of the moment, a duchess who held the post and meant to keep it, noticed too, and was not pleased, and saw to it that the troublesome young woman from the edge of the forest was warned to keep her distance. For a while the road seemed to close, and then, as roads do in this story, it opened again by way of a death. In the winter of 1744, the reigning royal mistress fell ill and died, quite young and quite suddenly, and the place at the very centre of the king's private life stood empty. Louis was grieving in his heavy, melancholy way, and a grieving king is a king in want of consolation, and the vast machinery of the court turned at once, as it always did, to the urgent question of who would fill the vacancy. There were candidates, there were factions, there were noble families pushing forward their daughters and their cousins, because to place a woman in the king's bed was to place a hand on the levers of the kingdom. It is worth pausing on the man at the centre of all this scheming, because he is too easily reduced to a bored sensualist, and he was a sadder and stranger figure than that. Louis XV had been orphaned as a tiny child, and crowned a king before he could properly understand it, raised in a glare of attention that never once let up, and he had grown into a man who possessed everything and felt much of the time next to nothing, oppressed by a melancholy that contemporaries struggled to name, and that we might recognize more readily today. He was intelligent, well-read, capable of charm and of real tenderness, and he was profoundly, constitutionally bored, hunting and gambling and chasing women, not out of any real appetite, but in a restless flight from the grey weight that settled on him whenever he was still. To capture such a man was not, in the end, a matter of beauty, of which his court had no shortage, nor even of cleverness alone. It was a matter of being able to reach down into that grey weight and lift it, of making the hours beside you the only hours in his crushing life that did not feel like a burden. That was the true vacancy at the centre of Louis XV, the one no duchess had managed to fill, and it was the one the young woman from the forest's edge, who had studied the lifting of mood since girlhood, was singularly fitted to occupy. And into that opening, in the first months of 1745, there came an invitation that the rest of Europe would still be discussing decades afterward. There was to be a masked ball at Versailles, a great public masquerade thrown in the Hall of Mirrors to celebrate the marriage of the king's eldest son, the Dauphin. And among the hundreds invited to come masked into the glittering heart of the palace was a certain young married woman from the edge of the forest of Senart. I want to take you into that night properly, because it is one of the genuinely cinematic moments in all of the 18th century, and because it is the hinge on which her life swings round from preparation into the thing itself. So let the salon and the forest fall away behind us, and let us walk together into the Hall of Mirrors on a cold February night in the year 1745. You would have come up through the palace in a slow press of bodies and candlelight, through room after room where the heat of 1,000 lamps and 1,000 people made the February frost outside seem like a rumour from another country, And then the Hall of Mirrors itself, which runs the entire length of the palace's garden front, a corridor of light longer than the eye quite wants to believe, lined down one wall with tall windows onto the black gardens, and down the other with a single unbroken sweep of mirror, arch after arch of silvered glass, so that each candle is doubled, and each doubled candle is doubled again in the facing window, until the air itself seems to be made of moving gold. Now fill that shining tunnel with masked figures, hundreds of them, in dominoes and dresses and disguises, the court and half of fashionable Paris transformed into a slow river of beautiful strangers. The musicians are playing somewhere above the hum of voices. Nobody knows for certain who anyone is, which is the entire delicious point of a masquerade, and the king is somewhere in this crowd, masked like everyone else, and the delicious game of the evening, whispered behind each fan, is to find him. And then arrives the detail that no writer of fiction would dare invent, because it is simply too perfect to be allowed. The king did not come dressed as a king. Louis XV and a handful of his gentlemen entered that hall of light disguised as yew trees, clipped garden yews of the kind you would see trimmed into neat shapes along the broad avenues of the park outside, a small procession of walking topiary moving gravely through the crowd. It's a bit free for a single night to be no one at all. Somewhere in that crowd a young woman in a costume cleverly chosen to be noticed without seeming to ask for notice was watching the yew trees and waiting for the right one to draw near. When at last it did, when the king found his way to her, or she contrived for him to find her, a mask was lowered, a few words were exchanged in the gold and the music and the heat, and the promise that had been spoken over a 9-year-old girl in a fortune-teller's room 16 years before began very quietly, in the middle of a costumed crowd, to come true. By the time the candles in the Hall of Mirrors had guttered down toward dawn, the court understood that something had shifted underfoot. The young woman from the forest's edge had been seen with the king, had held him in talk far longer than courtesy required, had not let his attention slip away from her. Within days there was a supper, and then another, and then there were letters in the king's own hand carried discreetly out to Etiolles, and the discreet carrying of those letters told everyone who needed to know exactly what was happening. There is a small detail in this that I find telling, which is who was pursuing whom. We are used to thinking of the royal mistress as the one who schemes and angles and lays her traps, and certainly she had angled in the forest for years. But once the masked ball had done its work, it was the king who pursued, the king who wrote, the king who could not let the matter rest, the most powerful man in Europe suddenly behaving like any smitten suitor, sending his notes out to a married woman in the country and waiting on her replies. She had done the hardest part, which was to make herself unforgettable, and now she had only to be a little unavailable, a little slow to be won, and let his own desire do the rest of the work for her. It was the oldest art there is, practiced with a master's restraint. She did not throw herself at him. She let him come, and in letting him come she gave him the one thing his position almost never allowed him, the feeling of having chosen, of having pursued and won something rather than merely had it arranged and delivered. He had spent his life being given women. She let him feel he had caught one, and that feeling, that she was his own discovery and his own conquest rather than the court's latest provision, was part of what bound him to her so much more deeply than to any of the others, for so much longer. The vacancy was being filled, and it was being filled not by a duchess or a daughter of the noble houses, but by a financier's daughter named Fish, and the court, watching, could hardly believe its eyes. We are going there next, into the strange, swift spring, in which a commoner was taken apart and rebuilt into a marquise, and in which an adoring husband was quietly, permanently removed from the story of his own marriage. The spring of 1745 must have felt to the woman living through it like being lifted by a wave she had spent her life learning to swim toward, and which she now had to ride or be drowned by. The king wanted her, and that much was settled within weeks of the masked ball. But wanting and installing are very different things, and to install a married commoner as the acknowledged companion of the King of France was a piece of social engineering that had to be carried through with enormous care, because the court was watching, and the court did not approve. First there was the husband to be dealt with. Charles Guillaume, who had loved her so openly and so foolishly, was informed that his wife would not be coming home to him, and the news very nearly destroyed him. He wept, he protested, he had to be coaxed and managed, and when coaxing failed, simply overruled, soothed in the end with appointments and money, and the unanswerable fact that one does not contend with a king for the possession of one's own wife. The marriage was never dissolved, for such marriages were not, but it was finished in all the ways that mattered, and the adoring young husband walks out of her story here, in its opening minutes, the first casualty of her rise, a man whose single crime was to have married a woman that destiny had already marked for someone else. He did not recover quickly. For a long time he could not bring himself to forgive her or to speak of her without bitterness, and who could blame him? For he had done nothing but love his wife, and had lost her to the one rival on earth against whom no husband could contend. In time he found another marriage and other consolations, and the wound presumably healed over as wounds do. But there is a small human ache in his disappearance from the tale that I do not want to hurry past, because it is the first of the prices her assent exacted from the people around her, and it would not be the last. Greatness of her kind is never bought cheaply, and it is rarely the great one alone who pays. Then came the problem of what she was to be called, because she could not possibly be presented at the most rank-obsessed court in Europe as plain Madame d'Etioles, daughter of a disgraced grain speculator named Fish. So the king solved the difficulty the way kings solve such things, which is to say he bought the answer. There was an estate in the country called Pompadour, with a marquisate and an ancient coat of arms attached to it, and the king acquired all of it and bestowed it upon her title and arms and all, so that by the late summer of 1745 the commoner from the counting-house had become, with a stroke of the royal pen, the Marquise de Pompadour. It was a name she would carry for the rest of her life, and one that history would never afterward consent to let go of. Everyone understood that the nobility was manufactured, freshly minted, conjured out of the king's pleasure rather than out of blood and time, and to the families whose lineage ran back to the Crusades, the very manufacture was an insult, a cheapening of the thing they held most sacred. And yet the title, manufactured though it was, did real work, and she knew exactly how to make it do more. A name is a kind of armour and a kind of flag. With the marquisate came an estate, a coat of arms, a place, however contested, in the great chain of precedence, and a way of being addressed that her enemies could not refuse her without insulting the king who had bestowed it. She took the arms and made them her own, set them on her carriages and her porcelain and her buildings, and lived up to it so completely, with such taste and such command, that within a few years the Pompadour she had been handed was more famous than the old Pompadours who had held it for centuries, and it belonged, in every mind in Europe, to her. That is what she did with everything she was given. She did not merely accept the gift and rest in it. She took it up and built upon it, and made it larger and brighter than it had been, until the borrowed name became unmistakably and only hers. The king gave her a name. She gave it back to history transformed, so that now, when you say Pompadour, you do not think of an estate in the country at all. You think of a woman. She had made even her title into a self-portrait, but it was nobility enough to carry her through the doors of Versailles, and through those doors she fully intended to go. Before she could go through them, though, she had to be taught to walk through them, and here is one of the details I find most extraordinary in the story. She had a single summer, a handful of months, to learn what the people born inside Versailles had spent their entire lives absorbing without ever having to think about it. The court of France ran on etiquette the way a great clock runs on its escapement, an endless and merciless code governing who entered a room before whom, and who might sit, and on what kind of seat. A stool or a chair with a back or a chair with arms, each one a precise statement of rank, and who was permitted to hand the king his shirt in the morning, and in exactly what order the great families took precedence over one another, down to the smallest gesture. A single wrong move, a curtsy held a beat too long, or released a beat too soon, a place taken that should have been yielded would brand her forever, as the impostor her enemies already knew her to be. So through that summer she was drilled. A seasoned courtier was assigned to coach her, and she worked at it the way she had once worked at the harpsichord as a child, with that same ferocious and patient application, compressing a lifetime of bred-in instinct into one season by main force of will. And when she was at last presented formally at court that September, she performed it without a flaw. She made her 3 deep curtsies. She exchanged the exact prescribed few words with the king and the queen and the royal family. She withdrew without a misstep, and the assembled court, leaning forward to watch the fishwife stumble, was denied its satisfaction entirely. Let me set you in that afternoon for a moment, because the courage of it is easy to miss in the bare account. Picture her dressed and waiting in the formal court habit that the occasion demanded, the wide stiff skirts, the long train that had to be managed with the feet alone in a sequence drilled into her over weeks, the rules of which had ruined other women's debuts before they had crossed the room. Picture the gallery full of the greatest people in France, every one of them an expert in this one art of the body, all of them willing her to err. She must enter, advance, and make her 3 reverences, sinking lower each time, the train flowing out behind her without the slightest check or tangle, and rise and speak the few permitted words, and then, hardest of all, withdraw, which meant retreating backward from the royal presence, never turning her back upon the king, managing that treacherous train all the while by a flick of the heel she had practiced until she dreamed of it. And she did it perfectly, cold-faced and graceful, while her heart, one imagines, hammered against her stays. She had walked into the lion's own den and performed their most sacred dance better than they could have wished, and they hated her the more for it, because a stumble would at least have confirmed what they believed. And instead she had given them flawlessness, which they could neither forgive nor forget. But not stumbling is a long way from being welcomed, and welcomed she was not. I want to be honest with you about how hostile the place she had entered actually was, because it is tempting to imagine her ascent as a smooth and shining thing, and it was nothing of the kind. To the old aristocracy of Versailles, she was very nearly an obscenity. Royal mistresses in themselves were an accepted feature of the landscape, regrettable to the devout but familiar to everyone, and they had always at the very least been drawn from the nobility. Women whose blood entitled them to stand near the king even in sin. This one was a bourgeoise, a creature risen out of the financial classes the nobles lived upon and looked down upon in equal measure, and her elevation felt to them like the natural order of the universe being turned upside down before their eyes. So they mocked her, without mercy and without much wit, in the way that frightened powerful people always mock. They made an endless industry of jokes about her maiden name, about fish and fishwives and the stink of the market stall, an entire genre of cruel little verses that came to be known as the poissonnades, and they passed them from hand to hand along the mirrored galleries and out into the streets of Paris, where the city took them up and added filth of its own. You should understand how this worked. because the war of paper was a real and constant front in her life, not a passing unpleasantness. France in that century was a country without a free press, but absolutely awash in the unofficial kind, in songs and squibs and copied verses and handwritten libels that circulated faster than any printed sheet could have done, passed mouth to mouth in the cafes and the markets and the antechambers, the gossip of a nation finding its own channels. Gwinget. A clever, cruel couplet about the favourite could be composed at Versailles in the morning and sung in the gutters of Paris by night, and there was no stopping it and no answering it. The verses fastened on everything: her birth, her fishy name, her supposed coldness, her spending, the king's appetites, and they grew steadily more savage as the years and the disasters mounted. To be the target of all that, year upon year, knowing it was being recited and relished the length and breadth of the kingdom, would have hardened anyone, and it hardened her. She learned to wear a face that gave the libellers nothing, to walk through a court that was laughing at her as though she could not hear, and the discipline of that daily pretence was its own slow tax upon the spirit, paid out in private, and never once shown. She heard them. You should understand that she heard very nearly all of it, because a court is a small and airless place, and unkindness travels fast through small airless places, and she had to walk those mirrored galleries each day, knowing that half the beautiful bowing people she passed had been laughing the night before at a verse about the smell of fish. It would have crushed most people, and it was meant to. It did not crush her, and the reason it did not is the same reason she lasted where prettier and far better born women had lasted a single season and then vanished into the country. She did not try to fight the court on the court's own chosen ground of blood and lineage, because on that ground she could not win, and she knew it. She fought instead on the only ground where she was unbeatable, which was the king himself, his attention, his comfort, his boredom, the shifting weather of his moods. She made herself, day after day after day, the single most necessary person in his life, the one he wanted across the supper table, the one he wanted to talk to when the day's kingship had hollowed him out, the one he wanted beside him in the quiet hours that no one else was permitted to see. Let the duchesses sneer behind their fans. The duchesses did not possess the one thing that mattered, which was the man, and as long as she held him, the sneering could circle her forever and never once land. There was, however, one person at Versailles whose hostility could genuinely have destroyed her, and whose friendship, against all reasonable expectation, she set herself to win, and that was the Queen. Marie Leszczyńska was the daughter of a dethroned Polish king, a devout, gentle, much-enduring woman who had borne Louis 10 children and watched him drift, year by year, out of her bed and into the arms of a succession of mistresses, and who had reason enough to loathe the latest and most formidable of them. A lesser woman in Pompadour's place would have treated the Queen as an obstacle to be stepped over, or an irrelevance to be ignored, exactly as previous mistresses had. Pompadour did the precise opposite. She approached the Queen with an elaborate, sustained, and apparently sincere respect. She never pushed herself forward in the Queen's presence, never claimed a precedence she had not been granted, never gave the smallest public sign that she considered herself the King's true companion while the Queen could see or hear her. She paid her court as humbly as the most dutiful subject in France. She is said to have told the Queen, in effect, that her dearest wish was simply to please her, and then she behaved year upon year as though she had meant it, and the Queen, who was no fool, and who had learned through long disappointment to read sincerity from its counterfeit, came in time to a kind of weary peace with her. It was a masterstroke, and it was also, I have come to think, something more than mere strategy. There runs through Pompadour's long handling of the Queen a thread of real tenderness, a steady refusal to humiliate a woman whom the entire court fully expected her to humiliate, And that refusal tells you something the cruelty of the Poissonnards never managed to capture. She understood humiliation from the inside, none better. She had swallowed a good deal of it herself, in those galleries, in those verses. And so, where she had the power to inflict it on another, she very largely chose not to. The reconciliation between the wife and the woman who had supplanted her would one day reach a height so improbable that no novelist would have dared to write it. But its foundation was laid right here, in these early careful bows and well-judged silences, by a young woman who had grasped, faster than anyone around her, that the surest way to disarm a court was to be, to the one person entitled above all others to hate her, unfailingly and disarmingly kind. Imagine the delicacy of it in practice, day after day. The Queen and the favourite would meet, as they had to, in the routines of the court, and all eyes in the room would slide toward the encounter, hungry for some flash of malice or triumph or mortification, and each time the favourite gave them nothing to feed on. She was deferential without being servile, attentive without being familiar, perfect in each gradation of respect that the Queen's rank demanded and her own delicate position required. She made small gestures, gifts, courtesies, the quiet smoothing of difficulties in the Queen's household, the careful avoidance of any honour or precedence that might wound. There is a story that she sought a formal reconciliation and offered, in so many words, her wish to be of service, and that the Queen received it with a guarded grace, and that from then on a kind of cool truce settled between them that slowly, against all probability, warmed. The court watched for the truce to crack for years, and it never did, and in the watching they learned something about the woman they had underestimated. She was playing a far longer game than they were, with far more patience, and she did not waste her power on the cheap satisfactions of humiliating a rival when she could spend it instead on the lasting prize of being thought, even by her victims, a woman one could not easily hate. To understand what her private rooms meant, you first have to feel the weight of the public palace they were hidden inside, because Versailles was not a comfortable place, and it was never, for a single waking hour, a private one. Let me set you down in it for a moment, in the cold of an ordinary morning. The palace held thousands of people, courtiers and servants and petitioners and hangers-on, packed into its endless wings, and most of them lived in conditions that would astonish you, in cramped, unheated rooms up under the roofs, along corridors that stank, by all honest accounts that survives, of crowding and of worse, for all the gold on the ceilings below. It was bitterly cold in winter, so cold that wine was said to freeze at the king's own table, and the staterooms were draughty caverns through which the wind walked freely. And over all of it, from waking to sleeping, ran the ceaseless machinery of ceremony. The King of France did not simply get out of bed. He was raised in a ritual called the lever, performed each morning before a standing crowd of the privileged, who were ranked and admitted in waves according to the exact degree of their importance, and who watched and competed for the honour of handing him a sleeve or a candlestick, while he was washed and shaved and dressed by relays of noblemen, for whom this was the summit of earthly distinction. He dined often in public, eating alone at a small table while the court filed past to watch him chew. His smallest movement through the day was an event, attended, recorded, fought over. To live at Versailles was to live entirely on a stage, observed at all hours, your smallest action read for meaning by 1,000 watching eyes, and there was, in all that vast magnificent pile, scarcely anywhere a person could simply be alone and be themselves. That is the airless, glittering, exhausting machine the king lived inside, and it is the key to everything she built, because what she offered him, up the hidden stair, was the one thing the machine of Versailles was designed to make impossible. She offered him somewhere to stop performing. So now let me take you up the back stairs into the part of Versailles that the visitors of later centuries would never be shown, because this is where she truly lived and where her real power was kept. The Versailles of the imagination is the Versailles of the grand staterooms, the hall of mirrors, the king's public rising and the king's public dining performed each day before standing crowds like a sacred theatre. But above and behind all that ceremonial splendour ran a warren of smaller rooms, the private apartments, low-ceilinged and intimate, and reached by hidden staircases tucked behind the panelling, and it was here that the king escaped for a few hours from the unbearable labour of being the king. The Marquise de Pompadour had rooms among them, close to his own and connected to his own by a private stair, so that the most powerful man in Europe could come to her without the watchful court counting his footsteps. Picture those rooms in the evening, because to picture them is to understand her. The grandeur scaled down at last to something a human being could actually live inside. Panelled walls painted in soft greens and in that particular rose that the porcelain works would one day name after her. Mirrors, but small ones, throwing back the light of a manageable few dozen candles rather than 1,000 porcelain on the shelves, fresh flowers in the porcelain, books left open where she had set them down, a harpsichord, a writing table, the refined and happy clutter of a woman of perfect taste who had unlimited money and exact opinions about how it should be spent. A fire in the grate, the smell of beeswax and wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of hothouse flowers in midwinter. And here of an evening, when the public day was finally done, the king would come up the hidden stair, and a small handful of trusted intimates would gather, and they would have supper together, in a way scarcely imaginable at that court, which is to say, informally, among friends, with the crushing apparatus of state left at the bottom of the staircase. There were suppers in those private rooms at which the king himself helped to pour and to serve, at which the talk ran easy and the laughter was real, at which Louis XV was permitted, for a few precious hours, to be a tired, clever, melancholy man, rather than the burning centre around which all of France was compelled to turn. And the woman who made those hours possible, who chose the guests and steered the conversation and read the king's mood the instant he came through the door and gave him, unerringly, the exact evening he needed, was indispensable in a way that no title could confer and no rival could ever counterfeit. Sit at one of those suppers a moment. The doors closed against the great cold palace beyond. A small round table, a handful of guests chosen with the care a jeweller gives to setting stones, the conversation light and quick and entirely free, for once, of the deadly weighing of precedents that governed each other table in Versailles. The dishes brought up by trusted servants or, on certain evenings, prepared at the table itself, the king delighting like a boy in the novelty of pouring his own coffee, of being, for an hour, not waited upon, but simply among friends. And she at the centre of it, reading him, always reading him, sliding the talk away from any subject that might darken his mood and toward the ones that drew him out, drawing the shy guest into the light and gently checking the loud one, keeping the delicate evening aloft on a current of ease that looked entirely natural and was, in fact, the most studied performance in France. He could not have told you how she did it. He knew only that the evenings in those rooms were the best hours of his life, and that she was the reason, and that was a knowledge worth more than any crown could buy, and more durable than any beauty could promise. That, far more than the bedroom, was the true seat of her power, and people came to understand it slowly. They came to understand that the surest road to the king's ear ran straight through her drawing-room, that a word from her could lift a career or quietly end one, that the composed woman pouring the coffee in the private apartments had become, without anyone ever quite deciding that she should, one of the central figures in the governing of France. Ministers learned to seek her out. Ambassadors learned to seek her out. The very same dukes who had circulated the fishwife verses learned, with whatever private grinding of teeth, to request appointments in her rooms, because she now possessed the one commodity they all desperately wanted, which was access, and she dispensed it with the cool care of a born politician. She had taken a few intimate chambers at the top of a hidden staircase and turned them into the actual heart of a kingdom, and she had done it by grasping, more clearly than any minister of state ever did, the single simplest fact about Louis XV, which was that he was profoundly, incurably lonely, and that whoever could ease that loneliness would, in the end, govern him. Before we follow her into the grand public works of her middle years, I want to take you into one particular room, on one particular kind of evening, because it shows you better than anything else what she understood about the man she had to keep, and what she was willing to do with her own gifts to keep him. In the late 1740s, she did something no royal mistress had ever thought to do. She built a theatre inside Versailles, a small private theatre in the heart of the king's own apartments, and she put herself on its stage. It began almost as a game, a way of filling the long blank evenings when the king's melancholy threatened to swallow him, and it grew into one of the wonders of the court. A prize courtiers schemed and grovelled and very nearly wept to be admitted to. Understand what those long blank evenings were, for a man like Louis, and you understand why the theatre was a stroke of something close to genius. The day's business done, the public rituals performed, the hunt ridden, there came the empty hours that the king most dreaded, when there was nothing left to distract him from the grey weight he carried, and when a sovereign's boredom could curdle into a black mood that made him impossible and made him miserable. Those hours were dangerous, for him and for everyone around him. And into them she introduced the most absorbing diversion a cultivated person could devise, not cards, not the usual idle pastimes, but the full living spectacle of the theatre, made fresh each season, demanding his attention, surprising him, moving him, and starring the one woman alive whose company never wearied him. It gave the empty evenings a shape and a purpose. It gave him something to look forward to through the dull machinery of the day, and it gave her a way to be, several nights a season, the most fascinating object in his entire field of vision, transformed and lit and singing, renewing in him, again and again, the spell she had first cast in a hall of mirrors. The theatre was an entertainment, yes. It was also the most elegant instrument of attachment ever devised, and she played it as skilfully as she played the heroines upon its little stage. Picture how it was done, because the doing of it was half the marvel. There was no room at Versailles built to be a theatre, so she had one improvised, a portable stage of timber and painted canvas raised in a gallery near a staircase, struck and rebuilt for each performance, with proper scenery and proper machinery, and a little orchestra, and an audience of perhaps 14 souls, no more, seated in the candlelight on the far side of the footlights. And onto that small stage, before the King of France and the dozen most favoured people in his life, stepped the Marquise de Pompadour, in costume, in character, to act. She had been trained for this since girlhood, you will remember, drilled in recitation and in the private theatricals of her mother's drawing-room, and now all of it came good at once. She played the leading roles, the heroines of Molière and the new operas, and she did not merely get through them. She was, by all accounts that survive, genuinely excellent, with that clear, true singing voice and that frightening gift for becoming, wholly and effortlessly, whoever the part required her to be. And she ran the enterprise as well as starring in it, which tells you as much about her as the acting did. She chose the plays and the operas, recruited the performers from among the courtiers and drilled them, oversaw the building of the scenery, and the sewing of the costumes, and the hiring of the little orchestra, kept the accounts, soothed the jealousies, and held the entire fragile undertaking together by the same managing genius she would later turn upon the affairs of state. The rules of admission she laid down were strict and famous, designed to keep the standard high and the favour exclusive, and the breaking of them was an offence. It was in miniature a complete demonstration of how she worked, the taste to choose well, the discipline to execute, the political instinct to make it into a prize that the mighty would scheme to be granted. Courtiers who had never in their lives troubled to be civil to her now flattered and manoeuvred for a place among the audience, and she dispensed the places and noted who deserved gratitude and who did not, and filed the knowledge away. The little theatre was a delight, and it was also a school in which she perfected the art of governing through pleasure, the art that would carry her, when the footlights went dark, all the way to the centre of a kingdom. Now hold the scene in your mind. The candles banked along the edge of the little stage, throwing their warm, unsteady light up into her painted face. The tiny audience hushed in the dark beyond, and at its centre the king leaning forward, watching the woman who ran his private life transform herself into someone else entirely for his pleasure, singing, weeping, laughing on cue, holding the small bright room in the palm of her hand. There is something almost unbearably knowing about it when you understand what she was doing. She was reminding him, night after night, of exactly why he could not do without her. She was showing him, in the safest and most delightful possible form, the very secret of her power, which was that she could be for him anyone he wished, and make the becoming look like nothing at all. The performance on the stage was a perfect small mirror of the performance she gave him hour upon hour off the stage, and he loved her for both, and could not always have told you where the one ended and the other began. The little theatre became naturally an instrument of power in its own right, because everything at that court became an instrument of power eventually. To be granted a seat among the 14 was to be marked as one of the king's true intimates, and to be passed over was a wound that proud nobles felt to the bone. Duchesses who would not have crossed the road for the fishwife of the Versailles now begged, through any channel they could find, for an invitation to watch her act, and she controlled the list. And the controlling of the list was another quiet thread of dominion gathered into her clever hands. In the end, the theatre grew too expensive and too talked about, and was let go, after a few brilliant seasons, as such enchantments always are. But while it lasted, it was the purest distillation of who she was, the trained girl from the counting house, standing in borrowed candlelight at the centre of the most exclusive room in Europe, holding a king spellbound with the one art she had been raised from childhood to perfect. And when the footlights were finally put out for the last time, she simply turned that same genius for transformation onto a larger stage and set about remaking the face of France itself. If you want to understand what set Pompadour apart from any other woman who ever held her precarious position, you have to understand that she treated being the king's favourite as a vocation, and the vocation she chose for herself was the patronage of beauty. She had been raised among artists, taught to draw and engrave by Boucher himself, surrounded since girlhood by the most cultivated minds in France, and she possessed taste of a depth and seriousness that the noble born around her, for all the antiquity of their blood, simply did not have. And now she had a king's resources standing behind that taste, so she spent. She spent on a scale her enemies counted up with greedy horror, and used against her for the rest of her life, and long after it, and it is perfectly true that the sums were enormous. It is also true that much of what she bought is still standing, still beautiful, still crossed by oceans of visitors each year, while the families who sneered at her spending have crumbled into footnotes. Take the porcelain, because it is the most intimate window into how her mind actually worked. There was a small, struggling porcelain manufactory that she took beneath her wing and effectively willed into greatness, the works that became the royal porcelain of Sèvres, the most celebrated in Europe. She did not merely sign the checks and walk away. She involved herself deeply in the glazes and the gilding and the modelling, and above all in the search for colours that no one had achieved before. Imagine the patience and the passion of that. Imagine summoning the finest chemists and the most gifted craftsmen in the kingdom and setting them, at ruinous expense, to the problem of capturing a particular shade, firing and failing and firing again, until the kiln at last gave up a deep, rich rose that had never existed before, a pink with the warmth of living flesh in it, which the works produced in her honour, and which is still called, to this day, Rose Pompadour. To care that much about the exact register of a colour, to have the power to command a kingdom's craftsman to chase it for you, and to know the difference, with your trained engraver's eye, between true excellence and mere costliness, that was the texture of her patronage. There is a hidden craft of labour behind a single beautiful cup, and she understood it as few patrons ever have. To make porcelain at all, in that age, was a half-secret art, a matter of clays and minerals and temperatures guarded jealously from one country to the next, and to make it as fine as the works she championed meant chemists and modellers and gilders and painters, all bent to a single exacting standard. The colours were the hardest part, the deep even blues, the greens, the famous rose, each one the result of long trials in the searing heat of the kilns, where a firing could ruin a month's work in an hour if the temperature wandered or the mixture was wrong, and where the difference between a glaze that sang and a glaze that died was a matter of degrees no instrument could yet measure. She funded all of it, the failures along with the triumphs, the endless costly experiments that a manufactory run for mere profit could never have afforded. She bought the time it takes to perfect a single object, and the proof of her judgment is that the works she sustained went on to become the most celebrated of their kind anywhere, their wares carried to the courts of Europe and treasured long after she was dust, as the very height of what human hands and a discerning patron could achieve together. Attentive, specific, a little obsessive, the eye of a woman who had been made, stroke by stroke, into a connoisseur before she was ever made into a marquise. And Boucher, her old teacher, she lifted to the very heights of the age, commissioning from him the soft, luminous canvases that are now, for most of us, the very picture of 18th century France, and among them the portraits of herself that have fixed her face in the imagination of every century since. You have almost certainly seen one without knowing whose face you were looking at. A woman seated in a vast flowered gown of palest blue or green, the silk falling in rivers of light around her, books at her elbow, a globe nearby, a sheet of music, an engraving half-examined in her lap, and her own calm, intelligent, faintly amused composure, looking back out at you across 2.5 centuries. Those portraits were themselves a kind of argument, and a deliberate one. They show her not as a temptress, not as a painted seductress, but as a thinker, a reader, a woman of cultivation, surrounded by the instruments of the mind. That was entirely on purpose. She used the brush to tell France who she wished to be understood to be, and the campaign very largely succeeded because it is her version of herself, the cultivated patroness amid her books and her flowers, that has outlasted the centuries, and not the fishwife of the cruel little verses. There is one portrait above all that shows you how carefully she stage-managed even this, and it was made not by Boucher, but by the greatest pastelist of the age, a brilliant and famously difficult man named Maurice Quentin de la Tour, who worked in coloured chalks and caught the living face better than anyone then alive. The making of it became a legend in itself. Latour was an artist of monstrous pride who would not be hurried and would not be condescended to, and before he would consent to take her likeness, he is said to have laid down his conditions, that he was to be left undisturbed, that the famous lady was to sit for him as an ordinary sitter would, that there should be no parade of attendants and no interruptions to break his concentration. And so she sat for him, the most powerful woman in France, submitting herself to the tyranny of a chalk-stained commoner because she wanted, very precisely, what only he could give her. The story goes that the king himself wandered in during one of the sittings, and that Latour, scandalized at the breaking of his terms, threatened to gather up his chalks and leave, and had to be soothed, and that the king, amused, let himself be soothed, because both of them understood that for the length of a sitting, the artist was the only sovereign in the room. And what Latour set down, when she finally had her portrait, was an argument made entirely in objects. She sits at her ease in a great gown, yes, but look at the table beside her, and at what her hand rests near, a volume of the daring new encyclopaedia, the works of Montesquieu, the dangerous philosopher of laws and liberty, a book of music, an engraving she had made herself, the instruments of a serious and curious mind laid out for all to read. It is a portrait of a thinker who happens also to be a beauty, and that ordering, the thought placed first and the beauty allowed to come after, was the whole of what she wanted said about her. She had grasped, long before our own age of images, that a face could be a manifesto, and she used the finest hands in France to publish hers. This was statecraft of a kind no one had quite practiced before, the deliberate shaping of a public image through art, and she practiced it with the same care she gave to everything. She could not silence the verses that called her a fishwife, but she could answer them, not with verses of her own, which would only have prolonged the squabble, but with paintings, with porcelain, with the slow accumulation of beautiful and serious objects, all quietly insisting on a different story. Each portrait of her amid her books, each fine building raised under her patronage, each exquisite object that bore the mark of her taste, was a sentence in a long argument addressed to the future over the heads of her contemporaries. The contemporaries mostly lost the argument's thread, distracted by the immediate spite, but the future has read it clearly, because the future is left holding the objects, the paintings and the palaces and the porcelain, and the objects speak of a woman of cultivation and judgment and seriousness, while the spiteful verses have crumbled to dust in the archives. She understood, in other words, that the way to win against people who controlled the gossip of one generation was to appeal past them to the verdict of all the generations after, and she made that appeal in the most durable medium she could command, and across 2.5 centuries it has very largely succeeded. She gathered the makers of France around her and held her hand over it. Cabinet makers, goldsmiths, sculptors, weavers, the makers of bronze and gilt and lacquer, the people who could turn a pension and a steady stream of commissions into a flowering of work. She sought them out and sustained them and pushed them to do their finest. The high 18th century style we now think of as quintessentially French, all that grace and lightness and exquisite finish, that air of a civilization that has decided beauty is worth any amount of trouble, owes more to her judgment than to any other single figure of the reign. When we picture the France of that century at its most refined, the gilded panelled rooms, the porcelain glowing on the mantel, the slender elegant furniture, the soft pastoral pictures, we are very largely picturing a France that passed through her hands and was shaped by her eye. She did not invent the taste of her age, but she focused it, funded it, and drove it to a pitch of refinement it would never have reached without her, and that is a true and lasting achievement, and it is hers, and no quantity of mockery about the smell of fish could ever take it from her. Nor was her cultivation only a matter of commissioning others. She gathered one of the finest private libraries in France, thousands of volumes ranging across history and philosophy and poetry and the sciences, not as ornament, but as the working tools of a mind that went on reading hard to the end of her life. She kept up her own hand at engraving, the discipline Boucher had taught the girl above the Paris street, cutting plates herself and taking real pride in the doing of it. She collected carved gems and drawings and rare bindings with the eye of a true connoisseur rather than a mere accumulator. The point worth holding on to is that the taste she imposed on a kingdom was first and last her own, earned at the workbench and the reading desk, and that is why it rings true across the centuries while the borrowed grandeur of her detractors has faded to nothing. But porcelain and paintings, however exquisite, are portable things made to be held and moved and shut away in cabinets, and she wanted to build in stone, and here her ambition reached its fullest scale and its most enduring monuments. She turned her patronage upon architecture, upon the very face of France, and the results of that are not locked away in museums but standing in the open air, where you can walk through them and beneath them and around them still, very likely without ever knowing whose will set them there. There is a vast square laid out in the heart of Paris in these years as a noble setting for a statue of the king, one of the grandest urban spaces in all of Europe, which we now call the Place de la Concorde, and her hand and the architects of her circle were behind its making. There is the École Militaire, the new military academy raised to train the officers of France, an enormous and costly project that she championed and argued for and pushed through against resistance and the eternal objection of the expense. There is an elegant townhouse in Paris that began life under her patronage and is now the official residence of the President of the French Republic, the Élysée Palace. And there is a small jewel of a building set among the gardens at Versailles, an intimate green retreat that she set in motion, the first conception of what would in time become the Petit Trianon, raised upon the near-revolutionary idea that even at Versailles, even at the burning centre of the most ceremonious court in Europe, a person might long for somewhere small and private and quiet to escape into. Walk out, in your mind, into the great square in Paris that her circle laid out, and you will feel the scale of what she was reaching for. It was conceived as a vast, open setting for a statue of the king on horseback, a grand civic space where the city could gather, and the monarchy could be seen in its glory, and the architects who shaped it gave it a breadth and an order that no medieval city had ever known, colonnaded buildings along one side, the river on another, sweeping vistas drawn out toward the gardens, and the gardens drawn out toward the horizon. The equestrian statue of Louis that stood at its heart is long gone, torn down in the revolution that her sheltered philosophers helped to make, and in its place other ages have set other monuments, and the square has worn other names. But the space itself remains, the proportion of it, the air and the light of it, one of the noblest open places on earth, and it carries within its very design her conviction that a proud nation owed itself beauty on the largest possible scale. The same conviction raised the long austere ranges of the military academy, where the sons of poorer noble families who could never have afforded such a training were to be made into the officers of France. She was not, whatever her enemies said, merely decorating her own life. She was trying, with a king's purse and her own unerring eye, to leave France more magnificent and more ordered than she had found it, and in stone at least. She succeeded past the reach of any verse. And then, against all that grandeur, there is the smallest of her buildings, and in some ways the most revealing, the green retreat among the gardens that grew in time into the Petit Trianon. For all her love of magnificence on the public scale, what she dreamed of for herself was the opposite, somewhere small, somewhere private, somewhere a person could simply be away from the crushing weight of the great palace and the thousand watching eyes. The idea of a retreat, of a place scaled to a human life rather than to the glory of a crown, was a radical one at Versailles, where everything was built to overawe and nothing to comfort. But she had lived inside that overawing machine for years, performing without rest, and she knew better than anyone how badly the soul needs somewhere to take off the armour. So among all the squares and academies she raised for the kingdom, she set in motion this one small refuge for the spirit, a house to escape into, a patch of green quiet at the edge of the most public life on earth. It is the truest self-portrait of all her buildings. The woman who could never stop performing, dreaming of a small room where at last she might stand back from that list a moment and take it in as a single design, a public square in the capital, a national military academy, a presidential palace, a royal garden retreat. These are not the idle leavings of a frivolous woman. These are the works of someone with a genuine and serious vision of what beauty and order and magnificence could do for a country, who happened to have climbed to a place from which she could command the resources to make the vision real. The aristocrats of her own day counted her building, like her spending, as further proof of her vulgarity, the upstarts squandering the treasure of France on her own monuments. History has done the accounting rather differently, because the aristocrats who sneered built nothing that anyone now crosses a city to see, and she built things that have quietly become the property of the world. That, I think, is the sweetest of all the revenges available to a woman they called common, that the common woman's taste is the one that still shapes how France is seen, and the noble blood that despised her has left no monument at all. And it was not only in stone and pigment that she chose to spend her strange power. She reached out her hand over the most dangerous and most important intellectual undertaking the entire century, and in doing so she made for herself enemies far more formidable than any sneering duchess, the implacable enemies of church and pulpit. In the middle of the century, a group of writers and scholars in France had set out on one of the boldest projects ever attempted by the human mind, an effort to gather all of human knowledge into a single vast work, and to arrange it by reason rather than by faith or inherited authority. It was called the Encyclopédie. Its editors were Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, and to the guardians of throne and altar, it was profoundly, intolerably dangerous. Behind its sober articles on agriculture and weaving and the making of pins lay a quiet, patient, relentless argument that human beings might understand the world by the light of their own reason and order their own affairs by it, without forever waiting upon priests and kings to tell them what was true. The men of the old order understood the threat perfectly well. They moved against the great book again and again, banned it, suppressed its volumes, hounded and imprisoned its contributors, and more than once they came within a hair of strangling it altogether. It survived. And one of the reasons it survived was the Marquise de Pompadour. She protected the philosophers. She used her position, her access to the king, her web of quiet influence over ministers and censors and licensors, to shield the project at the precise moments when a single hostile decision could have killed it. There is a famous scene from one of the private suppers, perhaps embroidered in the retelling but rooted in something true, in which the talk turned half in jest to a simple question of natural philosophy, what gunpowder was actually made of, what the very rouge on the lady's cheeks was actually made of, and it emerged, to general laughter, that not one person in that gilded room, full of the most privileged people in France, could say, and the point landed, gently and unmistakably, that here was a book that could tell them, a book that gathered exactly such knowledge and laid it open to anyone, and that perhaps a work of that kind ought, after all, to be permitted to exist. Whether the evening fell out in quite that shape scarcely matters, but picture it anyway, because it captures her world in a single scene. The supper done, the candles low, the most privileged people in France gathered in warmth and ease, and someone, idly, asks what powder is, the powder that fires the king's guns and wins or loses his wars, and the talk turns, and it emerges, amid laughter, that the dukes and the ministers and the titled ladies who command armies and estates and the destinies of millions, have not the first idea how the most ordinary substances of their own lives are actually made. They live surrounded by things they do not understand, served by knowledge they do not possess, riding atop a civilization whose workings are invisible to them. And here is a book, the daring forbidden book, that would lift the lid on all of it, that would explain the powder and the porcelain and the loom and the forge, that holds between its covers the actual workings of the world. To the men of the church that book was a weapon aimed at heaven. To a curious woman at a supper table, it was simply the answer to 100 questions no one had been able to answer, and surely, she might have thought, something that useful and that interesting deserved to live. It is a small scene, and a charming one, and underneath the charm it carries the quarrel of the age, the old order of inherited mystery against the new order of open knowledge. And she, at the table, on the side of knowing, what matters is that the new thinking, the thinking that would one day remake the world, found at the very summit of the old regime a powerful and willing friend, and that her name was Pompadour. The battles over the dangerous book were not abstract, and her protection of it was not without real risk to herself. Again and again, the church and the conservative courts moved to crush it. Volumes were condemned and ordered burned. The royal permission to print was revoked, then quietly restored, then threatened again. Diderot, the indomitable editor, had already known the inside of a prison cell for his writings, and laboured on under constant danger of returning there. Contributors fell away in fear. Others wrote on under false names or smuggled their pages out. Through all of it, the work needed friends in high places who could whisper the right word at the right moment, slow a condemnation here, find a sympathetic censor there, remind the king that suppressing his own kingdom's scholars only handed glory to the printers of other nations. And she was such a friend, steadily and at some cost, because to shield the philosophers was to stand against the very party that prayed for her downfall, the devots who already hated her and who saw in the encyclopedia everything they feared. She knew that. She shielded it anyway. It is one of the genuine paradoxes of her life that a woman whose existence depended upon the old order of king and church and privilege spent some of her precious influence keeping alive the ideas that would within a generation tear that order to pieces. Perhaps she did not see how far those ideas would run. Or perhaps in some clear cold corner of that formidable mind she did see and judged that the future belonged to the thinkers rather than to the priests, and chose quietly the winning side. She corresponded with Voltaire, who had never forgotten her kindness in the old salon days and remained, in his sharp and ungovernable fashion, her ally for life. She read the dangerous books herself, and understood them, and grasped, as so many around the king did not, that the ideas fermenting in those forbidden volumes were the future, and that France would be far wiser to make room for them than to exhaust itself trying to crush them. Even though she herself was a creature of the very court, those ideas would one day help to sweep into the river. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that, when you sit with it. The Enlightenment she sheltered carried within its own logic the sentence of death upon everything she had given her life to, the monarchy, the privilege, the glittering apparatus of Versailles, and she put her hand over it and kept it alive anyway. Partly from a genuine love of mind and beauty, I think, and partly because she recognized in those self-made thinkers something of her own self-made self. They, like her, had risen by sheer talent into an order that birth was supposed to govern utterly. She knew exactly what it was to be the clever upstart the established powers longed to silence, and so she shielded them, and the book lived, and in living it helped to light the slow fuse that would, a generation after her death, burn the old world down. That is the side of her that the cruel verses never once reckoned with. the woman of real intellectual seriousness who spent her dangerous power defending the most important thinking of her century. But I have been telling you of her public greatness for some while now, the building and the buying and the protecting of ideas, and all the time I have been holding something back, because to understand the rest of her life you must understand a turn that happened quietly, out of sight, behind each public triumph around the year 1750 and the years just after it. What had first carried her to Versailles, the king's desire, began to fade, and what she did about it is the most remarkable act of survival in all her remarkable story. She had never been a woman of robust health, and the forced brilliance of her upbringing seems to have been bought, in part, at the cost of a fragile constitution that nothing afterward could mend. The unrelenting strain of court life, the perpetual performance, the pregnancies that ended in loss and grief, all of it wore steadily on a body that had never been strong to begin with. And somewhere in her late 20s, the physical part of her bond with the king came by gradual degrees and then more or less completely to an end. The reasons were tangled past any clean telling: her uncertain health, her temperament, the simple cooling that time and familiarity work upon desire. But the fact of it was beyond dispute, and in her position it ought to have been a sentence of doom. A royal mistress whose hold upon the king is physical, and only physical, is finished the instant that hold begins to loosen. Each woman who had held her place before her had risen and then fallen on exactly that axis, and not one of them had found a way to stop the fall. By all the precedents the court possessed, Pompadour should now have been quietly discarded, pensioned generously, replaced by some fresh young beauty, and sent off to grow old on her estates while another woman climbed the hidden stair to the rooms that had been hers. That is not what happened. What happened instead is what makes her unlike anyone else in the long history of her office, and we are going to look at it closely now, because it is the deepest and the strangest, and in its way, the most human of all her transformations. When the desire faded, she did not fight to rekindle it, which would have been the obvious move, and the losing one. She did something far cleverer and immeasurably harder. She changed what she was to him. She set herself, deliberately, and with all her formidable intelligence, to become necessary to the king on each level except the one that was slipping away, so that by the time the lover was finally gone, the prince, the confidant, the counsellor, the companion of his mind, and the manager of his moods, what was so deeply woven into the daily fabric of his existence that he could no more cast her off than he could cast off his own habits of thought. She made herself the one person alive he truly talked to. She became the mind that could read his black moods the moment they gathered and lift them, that knew which courtiers to keep from him on a bad day, and which small amusements would draw him back out into the light, that remembered everything, judged shrewdly, and asked nothing for herself that did not also, somehow, serve him. A man can replace a lover. It is a far harder thing to replace the single mind in a crowded palace of flatterers that you trust without reservation. She made herself that mind, and in doing so she made herself, at last, unassailable. It was not a thing accomplished once and then enjoyed. It was a labour renewed each day, and the labour was enormous and invisible. She studied him as a scholar studies a text, learning his moods before he knew them himself, learning the difference between the silence that wanted company and the silence that wanted to be left alone, keeping ready at any hour the diversion or the amusement or the quiet sympathy that the particular weather of his spirit required. She had to be endlessly interesting and never tiring, present whenever wanted and absent whenever not, informed about everything that might amuse or concern him, and discreet about everything that might burden him. She had to manage his other relationships, soothe the quarrels, screen the bores, steer the right people toward him and the wrong people away, all without ever seeming to manage anything at all. It was the work of a lifetime compressed into each day, and she did it through grief and through illness, and through the long erosion of her own health, because the day she did it less than perfectly was the day she could be replaced. There is a kind of heroism in that sustained, unwitnessed effort, the heroism of the performer who must be flawless at each performance because there is no understudy and no night off, and she gave that performance without a single missed entrance for nearly 20 years. It cost her this transformation in ways we should not hurry past, because the price she paid is part of the truth of her. To keep her place beside a king whose desire had wandered, she had to make a kind of peace with where exactly that desire wandered to, and that peace was one of the most bitter bargains a woman ever struck with her own pride. There was, on the edge of the town of Versailles, a discreet and modest house in a quarter called the Parc aux Cerfs, the Deer Park, and to that house, across the years, there came a quiet succession of young women, some of them very young, kept for the king's private pleasure, well away from the court, well away from any breath of threat to the established order of his affections. It was a sordid arrangement, and there is no use whatever in pretending otherwise, and history has rightly judged it harshly. And the Marquise de Pompadour, the great patroness, the protector of philosophers, the most powerful woman in France, lived alongside it, year upon year. She is believed to have understood it, tolerated it, and perhaps in some measure quietly managed it, upon the cold and clear-eyed calculation that these girls, low-born and powerless and entirely interchangeable, could satisfy the king's body without ever once threatening her own irreplaceable hold upon his mind, his trust, his need of her. I want you to feel the weight of what that must have asked of her, because it is far too easy to read it merely as proof of her cynicism, and to miss entirely the cost. Here was a woman of extraordinary pride and exquisite refinement, who had remade herself entirely from the skin inwards to win this one man, now consenting, with her eyes wide open, to the plain fact that her victory could only be kept by surrendering the very thing she had first won him with. She held the centre by yielding the bed. She stayed close by, agreeing, in effect, not to mind. Whatever she truly felt about it in the locked privacy of her own heart, and we will never know, because she was far too disciplined ever to leave a record of such a thing, she made the bargain, and she kept the bargain, and she remained, through all of it, the one woman Louis XV could not do without. The girls of the Deer Park came and went like changes in the weather. Most of them never knew, or only half suspected, who the discreet and generous gentleman really was who kept them in their comfortable small house, and when their season passed they were, in the cold practical way of the arrangement, provided for, given a sum of money and married off to some respectable man glad of the dowry, and sent back into a quiet, ordinary existence. It was managed, in other words, with the same brisk efficiency that governed everything in that court. The satisfaction of a king's appetites turned into a quiet domestic department with its accounts and its arrangements, and the human beings passing through it treated as a matter of administration. There is something chilling in the very orderliness of it, more chilling, in a way, than open scandal would have been. And Pompadour lived with the knowledge of it, this institution running discreetly at the edge of the town while she held the centre, and she made, so far as we can tell, no move to end it, because to end it would have been to drive the king's wandering appetites toward women of a rank who might genuinely have threatened her, and that she could not risk. Pompadour stayed. Pompadour stayed. That is the brutal arithmetic underneath her survival, and the most striking thing about it is that she sat down and worked the sum herself, deliberately, and chose to live by its answer. So, we should be careful not to judge that choice too quickly from the comfort of a later age. She had no good options, only a range of bad ones, and she chose the one that let her keep what she had given her life to building. The alternative was not some dignified retirement to a happier place. The alternative was dismissal, exile from the only life she had ever truly known, the surrender of everything to the very enemies who longed to see her fall, and very likely an early death in obscurity, forgotten. Against that, the bargain she struck, however cold, however demeaning, was a kind of survival, and survival was the game she had been raised from childhood to win. She paid for it in pride and in something deeper than pride, in the slow grinding knowledge of exactly what she had agreed to tolerate, and she paid it without complaint, year upon year, because she had decided long before that there was no humiliation she would not endure rather than be sent away. It is not an admirable bargain. It is a human one, made by a woman with her back to a wall, and her eyes wide open, and the clear-eyed courage of it, the refusal to flinch from a choice she found necessary, is of a piece with everything else about her. She did not pretend the arrangement was anything other than what it was. She simply decided she could live with it, and then she did. And having given up the role of lover, she went on, against all expectation, to acquire a respectability that would have been simply unthinkable for any mistress who came before her. And this is where her story bends toward the improbable. But before we reach those honours, you should know that her enemies had not gone away merely because she had made herself indispensable. There was a standing party at court that hated her with a steady, righteous, religious passion, and had gathered around the king's own son, the Dauphin, a serious, devout, rather cold young man, who looked upon his father's favourite as a living sin lodged at the very heart of his family, and who never troubled to hide his contempt for her. The devots, the devout party, the partisans of the church and of strict morality, formed themselves into a permanent standing opposition, and their one recurring weapon against her was the one thing she could not buy or charm or outthink, which was the state of the king's immortal soul. For Louis XV, you see, was a believer. He was a sinner, comfortably and habitually, but he believed, and he feared, in the orthodox way of his time, the fires that waited for the unrepentant, and that fear was the single chink in the armour of Pompadour's power that no amount of cleverness could close. Whenever the king fell ill, whenever death seemed near, the devots would press in, the confessors would gather, and the talk would turn at once to absolution, and absolution required, as its absolute condition, the sending away of the woman who was the standing scandal of his court. She lived with that loaded weapon pointed at her year after year. She tried more than once to disarm it from her own side, by turning toward religion herself, by attempting to live as the king's friend rather than his lover might live, by seeking from the church the sacraments and the standing of a penitent. But the church would not have her on those terms. It demanded that she leave Versailles altogether, abandon her rooms beside the king, retire from the position that was her life, and that she could not and would not do, and so absolution was withheld, and she remained suspended forever, between a court that called her a sinner and a faith that would not let her stop being one. It was a cruelty of a quieter kind than the verses, and it bit, I think, far deeper. For consider the position it left her in. She had given up the lover's role, made herself the king's truest friend and counsellor, turned in her own way toward a more sober and respectable life, and still the church held her to be a soul in mortal danger and a standing occasion of sin, and would grant her no peace unless she abandoned the very life she had built. She could not have absolution while she stayed, and she could not bring herself to leave, and so she lived suspended between the two, year upon year, in a kind of spiritual exile that no amount of worldly power could end. There were moments when she tried hard to resolve it, when she took up devotions and good works and the outward forms of a penitent woman, hoping the church might soften. It would not. The terms were the terms, And meanwhile the devots watched and waited and prayed, not for her soul exactly, but for the moment her hold would slip, the illness or the accident that would frighten the king back to his confessor and let them sweep her out at last. She lived her later life in the shadow of that patient, pious enmity, knowing that the most powerful weapon in France was pointed at her, and that she could do nothing to take it away, only pray, with whatever faith was left to her, that the day it fired would never come. And yet, against the devots and the dauphin and the full weight of the church, the honours came to her all the same, because the king's need of her was, in the end, stronger than his fear. In the year 1752 he raised her again, this time to the rank of duchess, the very highest the French nobility had to offer, so that the daughter of the disgraced grain speculator, now ranked among the first ladies of the kingdom, took precedence over women whose ancestors had ridden to the Crusades, and was addressed by a style that the proudest blood in France could not gainsay. And then came the moment that I keep returning to, because no novelist alive would have dared to set it down. In the year 1756, the Queen herself, the same gentle, wronged, long-suffering Marie Leschinska, whose husband Pompadour had taken from her bed 11 years before, appointed her to a formal place in the royal household. She made her a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, a Dame du Palais, an honoured attendant upon the very wife she had supplanted. The reconciliation that had begun all those years ago in careful bows and well-judged silences had come, at last, to its full and astonishing flower. The mistress and the wronged wife now appeared together in public, the Queen's own household graced and served by the woman who had displaced her, and the court that had once passed fishwife verses about the newcomer could only stand and watch, and wonder how on earth it had come to this. Spare a thought, in the middle of this improbable triumph, for the Queen herself, because the arrangement asked something of her too, and she gave it with a dignity that history has been slow to honour. To accept into your own household, as an honoured attendant, the woman who has held your husband's heart for a decade, to appear with her in public and let the world see you reconciled, requires either a saintly forgiveness or a worldly resignation, or some hard-won mixture of the two, and the gentle Polish Queen, who had suffered more quietly than anyone in that palace, seems to have found her way to exactly such a peace. Maybe she had simply grown tired of grief. Perhaps she recognized in the favourite's unfailing respect a kindness that the situation did not require, and chose to meet it in kind. Perhaps, having lost the lover years before, she preferred the devil she had come to know, who at least treated her with courtesy, to whatever younger and crueler rival might otherwise have filled the place. Whatever moved her, the two women arrived together at a strange, grave dignity that shamed the sniggering court around them, and it stands as a quiet rebuke to everyone who reduced either of them to a type, the saintly wife and the scarlet mistress. They were both, in the end, intelligent women making the best of an impossible arrangement. Neither had truly chosen, and they made it, between them, with more grace than the men who had put them in it deserved. She built herself, in these years of honour, a refuge from the strain of it all, for a little while. On a hillside above the river Seine she raised a small enchanting chateau and called it Bellevue, beautiful view, and she poured into it everything her exquisite taste could devise, terraced gardens running down toward the water, hothouses for flowers out of season, rooms scaled not for the crushing display of royalty, but for the happiness of an actual human being, hung with the pictures she loved, and set about with the porcelain she had willed into existence. It was the nearest she ever had to a home of her own, an answer, in stone and glass and greenery, to the question of where, in all her dizzying grandeur, she actually belonged. You can imagine her there on a fine evening, walking the terraces with the light going gold over the river below, briefly and almost a private woman, briefly at peace. But you should not let that picture soften the truth too far. because at the very centre of all the power and all the honour she was, by now profoundly and irreparably alone. And the loneliness is the thing I most want you to carry away from this stretch of her life. Picture the plain, daily shape of it. She woke each morning to a schedule of obligations, of people to be seen, of business to be managed, and each one of those encounters was, in some degree, a transaction. The courtier who flattered her wanted something. The minister who consulted her was guarding his own position. The petitioner who praised her had a favour to ask. Even the king, whom she had given her life to, needed her, leaned on her, took from her the strength she had less and less to give, and offered in return a tired affection that was real, but was not any longer, the thing she might once have hoped for. There was almost no one in all that crowded, glittering court who simply wanted her company for its own sake, who asked nothing, who would have stayed had she lost everything tomorrow. What she had built was a position that made her the object of universal attention and almost no genuine love, watched by thousands and known by none, and she carried that contradiction in silence, because to speak of it would have been a weakness. And she had long ago resolved to show the world no weakness at all. The most envied woman in France went to her bed each night the most solitary, and the porcelain on the shelves and the paintings on the walls, for all their beauty, kept her no company in the dark. The king's trust she held, but his love had cooled away to a warm grey ash long before she had the deference of the entire court. But the genuine affection of next to none of it, surrounded always and everywhere by people who needed her, feared her, courted her, and a bare handful who simply liked her for herself. Her one true marriage had been broken in its first happy season for the sake of the throne, and she lived at bottom as a woman all of whose relationships were bent, however slightly, toward the maintenance of her position, who could never entirely lay the performance down, who had to remain, even with the few she trusted most, just a little on her guard, hour upon hour, for 19 unbroken years. She had won the game comprehensively against every rule and expectation, and the prize, when you look at it closely and without the gilding, was a beautiful suite of rooms at the top of a hidden staircase, filled with the most exquisite objects in Europe, in which a tired and failing woman, more and more often, sat reading the dispatches of a losing war entirely alone. For that, by now, was a large part of what filled her days. By the later 1750s, the Marquise de Pompadour had become, in everything but the name and the salary, one of the chief ministers of France. There was no office for it, no constitutional place, and that was the secret of its strength, because a power that rests on no office is a power that cannot be stripped away by the cancelling of an office. Hers rested on the king's trust, and the king's trust she held more fully than any minister in the kingdom, so the papers came to her rooms. The dispatches of ambassadors, the reports of generals, the requests and the schemes and the endless grinding paper of a vast state at war crossed her writing table, and she read it, and she understood it, and she formed her own clear views, and the king listened to those views as he listened to no one else alive. Ministers came to understand that their tenure of the great offices depended, in no small part, upon her good opinion of them. She helped to raise able men to power, and she helped to cast them down again when they failed her or crossed her, and the mightiest figures in France learned to pay their court in her drawing-room as anxiously as the humblest petitioner waiting in her antechamber. Ah, and consider what it meant, in practice, that she could raise a man and break him. There was a charming and cultivated churchman she had befriended in her early years at court, a witty abbé whose company she enjoyed and whose fortunes she made, lifting him stage by stage until he held one of the great offices of the kingdom and a cardinal's hat besides. For a time he was her creature and her ally, raised by her hand from genteel obscurity to the summit of affairs. And then the war went wrong, and he counselled courses she would not accept, and lost his nerve where she kept hers, and the friendship cooled into opposition, and she who had made him now unmade him, easing him out of power, and away from the king as smoothly as she had once eased him in. He went off to a comfortable exile in his diocese, a cardinal still, to nurse his grievance and write his memoirs, and his place was taken by the abler man she preferred. It is a small story, repeated in various forms across her years, and it tells you the plain truth of her position better than any title. Ministers rose because she favoured them, and fell because she withdrew her favour, and they knew it, and the knowledge bent each powerful back in France toward her drawing-room. She held no office that could be named, and she governed the men who held them all. Picture her at this labour, because it is a side of her that the soft Boucher portraits, with all their flowers and ribbons and sheet music, were in part designed to keep from your eye. Picture her in the cool morning light of the private apartments, the porcelain pushed aside, a litter of official papers and ciphered dispatches spread across the table before her, reading a report from the army in Germany with precisely the same exact attention she had once given to a passage of music or the glaze on a cup. She had a genuine head for affairs, a capacity to hold all the tangled threads of a complicated situation in her mind at once, and to judge men and their motives with a cool and seldom flattering shrewdness, and she bent that capacity now to the running of a leading power through the middle of a world war. Her judgment was not always sound, and the war itself would prove that bitterly enough, and the men she favoured were not always the right men for the hour. And there were hard limits to what she could do, which her enemies, who imagined her all-powerful, never properly grasped. She could influence the king, but she could not command him. In the end, he was the king, and she was a subject, and on the rare occasions he set his will against hers. Hers gave way. She could raise and lower ministers, but she could not make a beaten army win, or a lost colony return. She could shield a philosopher, or steer an appointment, but she could not change the deep tides of the age, the rise of Britain, the strength of Prussia, the slow exhaustion of the French treasury, the discontent gathering in the country far below the windows of Versailles. She rode those tides. She did not turn them. Much of what went wrong in the reign would have gone wrong with or without her, the product of forces no single person, however placed, could have mastered. But power of her conspicuous and irregular kind draws blame the way a lightning rod draws lightning, and so she was charged with everything, the failures that were hers, and the far greater failures that were nobody's or everybody's. And she had no way to refuse the charge, because to disclaim power would have been to lose it. She had to seem to control what she could not control, and then answer for the controlling. It was an impossible bargain, and she had signed it the day she climbed the hidden stair. But the seriousness of her was entirely real. She was not playing at government, the way her enemies liked to say, dabbling in matters too large for a woman's understanding. She was doing it, day after exhausting day, with a focus that would have worn down a person in the best of health, and she was by this time very far from a person in the best of health. Her great political discovery in these years was a clever, ambitious, quick-witted nobleman, whom she recognized early for a man of real ability, the Duc de Choiseul, and whom she promoted and shielded and steadily advanced, until he became the dominant minister of the later reign. It was, for once, a thoroughly sound piece of judgment. Choiseul was genuinely able, energetic and worldly and effective, and he steadied France through the worst of the war's grim aftermath, and held the government together through the difficult years that followed. Her ability to spot him among the crowd of courtiers, to back him, to win him the king's lasting confidence, was statecraft of a high order, and it is exactly what gets quietly forgotten when a long reign is summed up only by its catalogue of disasters. She made poor choices, and she made excellent ones, the same as any minister born and bred to the work, and the single fact that set her apart from all of them was that she had no right whatever, by all the rules of her world, to be making any choices at all. And that is the truly revolutionary fact at the heart of her, though she herself would have been horrified to hear the word, since revolution was the force that would one day devour everything she loved. Here was a woman, and not merely a woman but a commoner, exercising real and sustained power in the government of the most powerful kingdom on the continent, in an age that held both womanhood and common birth to be absolute and self-evident disqualifications from any public authority whatsoever. She had no vote, no office, no army at her command, no inherited right, none of the things upon which power was understood to rest. What she had instead was a method, patiently built, and it is worth understanding how the influence actually flowed, because it was not magic, and it was not merely the bedroom. It flowed through access, first of all, through the simple fact that she saw the king each day, in private, at his ease, and could raise a matter when he was receptive and let it lie when he was not, a timing no formal minister waiting his turn in an antechamber could ever match. It flowed through information, through the dispatches and reports that came to her table and the web of correspondents and clients who fed her what was happening in the ministries and the armies and the courts of Europe, so that she often knew a matter before the men whose business it was to know it. It flowed through patronage, through her power to advance a man's career or quietly stall it, which meant that ambitious men told her what she wished to hear and did what she wished done. And it flowed, above all, through the king's own reluctance to govern, his weariness with the grinding labour of decision, which she was willing to shoulder for him, sifting the choices, framing the options, presenting him in the end with the conclusion she had already reached, and letting him feel that he had reached it himself. That last art, the art of ruling a man while leaving him certain he rules you, is the subtlest of all the political skills, and she had it to a degree that frightened those who saw it clearly. She governed by seeming never to govern, and the seeming was the trick. She had only her own mind and the trust of one man, and with those two slender instruments and nothing else, she had made herself a force that empires were obliged to reckon with, to whom the formidable Empress of Austria herself condescended to write coaxing letters, upon whom the fate of ministers and the direction of wars and the alliances of nations visibly turned. It should not have been possible. Each structure of her world was arranged with deliberate care to make it impossible, and she did it anyway by sheer relentless force of intelligence and will, and she went on doing it for the better part of 20 years, and the doing of it took from her, in the end, far more than the watching court ever saw. For into a life already so largely spent in the management of other people's feelings, there came now a grief that no management on earth could touch, and it broke something in her that never afterward fully healed. She had a daughter. In all the endless intrigue and patronage and statecraft, it is dangerously easy to forget that the woman at the centre of it was also, and above everything, a mother, but she was, and her child was the one great unguarded love of her guarded life. Alexandrine had been born back in the Étiole's days, before any of this. The daughter of the marriage Pompadour had been made to leave behind, and the mother loved her with a fierce, plain, total love that nothing else in her schooled and careful existence ever came near. She called her by a pet name, the way her own family had once called her Rhinette, the soft private syllables that loving households keep for their children. She called her Fan-Fan, and she had plans for her, enormous, tender, ambitious plans, the kind a self-made woman makes for the one child who will inherit everything she has clawed and charmed and suffered her way toward. She dreamed of marrying Alexandrine into the very highest nobility, even, it was whispered, into some branch of the royal house itself, of spending every ounce of her hard-won influence to lift her daughter clean over each wall that had once stood in her own way, so that the granddaughter of the man they called Fish would be born, securely and unquestionably, inside the society that her mother had only ever managed to enter as an intruder. There is something piercing in those plans when you set them beside her own beginnings. She had clawed her way across each line her century drew, and she had paid for the crossing in loneliness and contempt, and the breaking of her own first happiness. And the one thing she wanted, more than the porcelain and the palaces and the power, was that her daughter should never have to claw at all, should simply be born on the right side of the wall and live there at ease. She visited the child at the convent when she could, by all accounts a tender and attentive mother in the hours she could steal from the king and the court, and she watched the girl grow with the fierce private hope of a woman investing everything she had suffered for in one small life. The marriages she schemed toward were dazzling, the very summit of what France could offer, and they were, in their way, the truest expression of all her ambition, because they were not for herself. She had won her own war already. Alexandrine was to be the peace, the proof that the war had been worth the fighting, the future in which all the loneliness finally brought something soft and good. And then, in a handful of feverish summer days, the future was simply cancelled. The child was being raised and educated at a fashionable convent in Paris, a place where the daughters of titled families were schooled, and there, in the summer of 1754, at the age of 10, Alexandrine fell suddenly and violently ill. It came on with the terrible speed of childhood illness in that century, a fever, a handful of dreadful days, and then she was simply gone. 10 years old, the one wholly unguarded love of Pompadour's life, the child for whom all the scheming and all the climbing had at last, in some hidden chamber of her heart, been the entire point, was dead before she had even grown up, and there was nothing at all, that the most powerful woman in France could do about it. No influence reached so far, no title, no access to the king, no command over the chemists of Sèvres or the architects of Paris could buy back the breath of a 10-year-old girl. For once in her life, each lever she had spent her years learning to pull connected when she threw all her weight upon it to nothing whatever. And then, as though grief were a tide that had resolved to take everything at once, her father died within days of her daughter. François Poisson, the disgraced speculator who had fled France under sentence of death when she was a small child, and who had lived, against all probability, to see that same child become the most influential woman in the kingdom, was gone too, in the same dark, crowded week. Within a span of a few days she lost the child who was her future and the father who was her past. The two ends of her own life severed away together, and she was left holding the middle of it alone. The court recorded that she was inconsolable, and the court was not a place much given to noting the inner lives of people, so for it to mark her grief at all is some measure of how total and how visible that grief must have been. I want us to slow right down here and simply sit with her for a moment, because this is the place where the public woman and the private woman come fully and finally apart, and where you can see, if you are willing to look, exactly what the long performance had been costing her all along. Picture her in those weeks. The most accomplished performer of her age, the woman who had learned as a child to become whatever any moment required, and to make the becoming look like the most natural thing in the world, sitting in her beautiful rooms among her porcelain and her paintings with the one single thing she could not perform her way around. The plans for Alexandrine had been the secret engine humming away beneath everything else, the quiet answer to the question of what, in the end, all the power had been for. And now the answer was gone, and the power simply remained, intact and entirely useless, an intricate machine still turning over with nothing left to make. She did not break down where the court could see it. Of course, she could not. She had built her position upon never once showing that caught a weakness it might use against her, and she was not going to begin now, even now. So she carried this grief exactly as she had carried the fishwife verses all those years before, inwardly, behind a composed and beautiful and perfectly maintained face, and she went back to the endless work of being indispensable to a king, while something essential and load-bearing within her had quietly stopped. Those who knew her in the years that followed said she was never quite the same again, that some brightness had gone out of her, that she worked harder and laughed less, and aged faster than her years should have allowed. The body that had never been strong began, from about this time, its long final decline. Grief is not only a feeling, it is a thing that happens in the flesh, and hers, already fragile, began to give way beneath the weight of it. And she carried that private ruin, unhealed, straight into the most consequential and most catastrophic decisions of her career, because even in mourning the work went on, and the work in these years turned more and more toward the high game of the nations, and toward a gamble in that game that would stain her name for 200 years. To understand what she did next, you have to understand the shape of Europe in the 1750s. So let me draw it for you quickly, because the human drama runs straight through the cold lines of the diplomacy. For centuries, the fixed enmity of the continent had been fixed and simple, and each statesman arranged his world around it. France and the House of Habsburg, the rulers of Austria, were the natural and hereditary enemies of Europe, and everyone built their alliances upon that hatred as upon bedrock. France stood with Prussia, the hard-rising military power to the north under its brilliant, cold, flute-playing king, Frederick. Austria stood with whoever happened to be opposing France. It was the oldest pattern in European politics, as settled and as unquestioned as the points of the compass, and the men who governed nations had built their entire understanding of the world upon its permanence. And then, in the middle of the decade, that whole compass spun on its pin, in a piece of statecraft so sudden and so complete that historians ever since have called it simply the diplomatic revolution. The ancient enemies changed sides. France abandoned Prussia and allied itself with Austria, its sworn foe of 300 years, while Prussia found new friends in the rising sea power of Britain. Two empires that had defined their very identities against one another for generations suddenly stood arm in arm, and this entire balance of the continent was remade in the space of a few months. It was one of the boldest reversals in all the history of European diplomacy, and the Marquise de Pompadour was bound up in the bringing of it about, deeply and intimately. The Austrians, you see, knew exactly where the true power at the French court actually lay, and they knew it did not lie only, or even mainly, with the ministers. The Empress of Austria, Maria Theresa, that formidable, devout, clear-eyed sovereign, understood that the surest road to Louis XV ran through the woman in the private apartments at the top of the hidden stair, and she courted her accordingly, with a frank pragmatism that her own pride must have found galling. There were letters. There was, by several accounts, a careful personal warmth cultivated between the proud Catholic empress and the bourgeois favourite. She would never in 1,000 years have consented to receive as an equal under any other circumstance, because now she needed her, and Maria Theresa was far too able a ruler to let mere pride stand between her empire and something it needed. The man who engineered the approach from the Austrian side was a cold and brilliant diplomat, the architect of Vienna's new strategy, who had grasped before anyone else that the old enmity with France was a luxury his empire could no longer afford, and who set himself to the patient seduction of the French court by any avenue that might serve. And the avenue that ran through the private apartments was, he saw at once, the most promising of all. So the courtesies came, the warm letters, the studied flattery of an empress condescending to write as one woman of consequence to another, and Pompadour received them and weighed them and saw in them what they were, which was both a genuine opening for France and a recognition at the very highest level of European power of exactly how much she mattered. There is a particular sweetness in that for her when you think of it. The proudest Catholic sovereign in Europe, who would not have admitted the financier's daughter to her presence under any ordinary circumstance, now wooing her by post because the fate of an alliance might turn on her goodwill. The fishwife of the verses had become a power that empresses courted. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the policy itself, that fact alone must have tasted, after all the years of contempt, very like vindication. Whether Pompadour was truly the architect of the new alliance, or rather one of its essential and willing enablers, is a question historians still turn over, but no one seriously doubts that she stood near the centre of it, that her vast influence was thrown behind the turn toward Vienna, and that without her the improbable reversal would have been far harder to accomplish. It was, in its bare conception, a bold and even a defensible stroke of strategy. Perhaps the old enmities had outlived whatever logic once gave them meaning. Perhaps a France and an Austria at peace might have reshaped the continent for the better and spared it a century of slaughter. But statecraft is judged, in the end, not by its conception, but by its results. And the results of this particular gamble were about to be catastrophic, because the great realignment of 1756 did not bring the peace its makers may have dreamed of. It is one of the bitter ironies of her life that her single greatest exercise of political power led to her single greatest disaster, and that the two are inseparable. Had the new alliance brought victory, had French arms triumphed alongside Austria and humbled Prussia and held the empire overseas, she would be remembered as the maker of a brilliant stroke, the woman whose judgment reshaped Europe to France's advantage. Instead, the alliance brought ruin, and so she is remembered, but when she is blamed at all, as the woman whose meddling lost a war and an empire. The policy was the same policy either way. Only the outcome differed, and the outcome was decided on battlefields and quarterdecks far beyond her reach, by the fortunes of generals and admirals and the cold competence of her enemies, over none of which a marquise in a palace, however powerful, had any control at all. She had helped to choose the partners. She could not choose the result. And history, which loves a simple story, has largely declined to draw that distinction, and has handed her the bill for a catastrophe that 100 hands besides hers helped to bring about. It brought, almost at once, the largest war the world had yet seen, and France would lose that war comprehensively and humiliatingly on land and sea and across 3 continents, and the woman who had helped to choose her partners for it would be handed the bill for the whole disaster. The conflict we now call the 7 Years' War broke out in 1756 and spread with terrible speed across the entire surface of the globe. It was fought not only on the battlefields of Central Europe, but in the snowbound forests of North America, in the blue waters of the Caribbean, on the burning plains of India, wherever the reaching empires of Europe touched and quarrelled and competed for the trade and the dominion of the wider world. It was, in a real and recognizable sense, the First World War, a vast struggle for global supremacy between France and Britain, with their continental allies marshalled in arms behind them, and for France it went, on very nearly every front, disastrously and ruinously wrong. The armies were beaten in Germany. The navy was broken at sea. There was one defeat in particular on a German field, where a far smaller Prussian force under Frederick himself caught the French army and routed it utterly, scattered it in an afternoon with a speed and a completeness that turned the proud army of France into a byword for humiliation across Europe. The news of it landed at Versailles like a physical blow, and it landed hardest of all upon the woman whose policy had set France on this road, because each reverse now had her name attached to it in the public mind. The mockery that followed that rout was savage even by the standards of the Poissonnards, and there was no shielding her from it. She had helped to choose the war's alliances, she had backed the ministers who ran it, and so she would carry the shame of its failures, fairly or not, and she knew it, and she did not flinch from the work, even as the work became a daily diet of bad news carried up the hidden stair. And across the great oceans, the proud French colonial empire began to come apart, piece by piece, in French hands. This is the war in which France lost Canada, the vast territory of New France, the land stretched along the great river of the St. Lawrence and reaching down through the heart of the continent, fell to the armies of Britain, and the dream of a French America died upon the heights above the city of Quebec. In India, the hopes of French power and French trade were broken in the same handful of years. By the time the exhausted nations made their peace, France had been stripped of empire on a scale that would shape the entire future of the planet, the world in which it would be Britain and not France that became the dominant global power for the next 2 centuries. The treaty that ended the war set the seal on the disaster, surrendering territory and trade and prestige in a settlement that France would smart under for a generation, until a later French king found his chance for revenge by helping the rebellious American colonies break free of the very Britain that had triumphed here. A revenge so costly that it would help bankrupt his kingdom and bring on the revolution. But all of that lay in the future, unguessed when the peace was signed. What was felt at the time was simply humiliation. The great power of Europe brought low, the colonies lost, the treasure spent, and the search for someone to hold responsible turning, as it always did, toward the most visible figure within reach, and a great deal of that immense and lasting turning was decided in the disastrous campaigns of the very war that the diplomatic revolution had helped to bring on. And in France, defeated, humiliated, drained white of treasure and of young men, the people looked about for someone to blame, and the favourite was the easiest and most obvious target in the kingdom. The same Poissonnades that had once mocked her birth now turned themselves, with fresh venom, upon her politics, blaming the Marquise for the defeats of the armies, for the loss of the colonies, for the blood and the gold poured out into the mud of Germany for nothing. It is grossly and self-evidently unfair to lay a global war at the feet of one woman, and historians have spent 2 centuries patiently untangling how much of the blame she actually deserves, which turns out to be a great deal less than her furious contemporaries heaped upon her. But fairness has never had very much to do with how a frightened and defeated people chooses its scapegoats, and she was the most visible figure within easy reach. That the upstart who had climbed too high, precisely the sort of person it is most satisfying to drag back down. The phrase that has clung to this bleak chapter, the words long attributed to her, or perhaps to the king, as the disasters mounted one upon another, after us, the flood, may very well never have been spoken by either of them in anything like those words, but it has stuck fast across the centuries because it captures something true about the mood of the dying years of that reign, a sense of a glittering, doomed order spending itself recklessly out with no thought at all for whatever might come after, and Pompadour, fairly or not, became the face that history chose to fix it to. She bore this too. By now she was bearing a very heavy load, the grief that never once left her, the failing body, the steady public hatred, the grinding strain of a vast war going wrong with her own name lashed to it, and through all of it she went on doing the work, because there was no one else the king trusted to do it, and because stopping was a thing she had simply never, in all her life, allowed herself to learn how to do. And then, in the very depths of all this, on a cold January evening, a man stepped out of the crowd at Versailles with a knife in his hand, and very nearly ended the reign, and her place within it with a single stroke in the dark. It was the 5th of January, 1757, a hard and bitter winter evening, and the king was at Versailles, preparing to leave for one of his other palaces. He came down toward his waiting carriage in the early dark, ringed about as always by guards and gentlemen, and the usual shifting press of people who gathered wherever in the world he chose to move. And out of that crowd a man stepped suddenly forward and struck him. The man's name was Robert Francois Damiens, and the blade he carried was a small thing, a folding knife of the kind anyone might own and use to trim a quill, and the blow it dealt the king, driven through the heavy layers of his winter clothing, was shallow and very far from mortal, but not a soul knew that in the first terrible moments. The king felt the cold sting of it under his ribs, put his hand to his side, brought his fingers away dark with blood, and cried out that he was wounded, that the man who had just touched him was the one who had done it. The assailant made no attempt at all to flee. He simply stood there in the lamplight amid the rising uproar, and was seized, and the king, believing now that he might well be dying, was carried back inside the palace. What followed in the hours and days after tells you everything you need to know about how thin the ground was beneath her for all the apparent permanence of her power. Because a king who believes himself to be dying turns, by the deepest of reflexes, to God and to the Church, and the Church had never once forgiven the Marquise de Pompadour. When Louis took to his bed, frightened and shaken and abruptly penitent, the devout party at court saw their long-awaited chance arrive at last. The priests gathered, the confessors hovered. The talk turned to absolution, to the setting right of the king's soul before whatever was coming for it. And a king who confesses and seeks absolution must, as the very condition of that reconciliation, send away the woman who has been the standing scandal of his reign. For a few days it looked entirely possible that the small knife of a half-deranged servant might accomplish in a week what 12 years of duchesses and verses and patient intrigue had wholly failed to do, and bring her down at last. She was kept from the king's side, and she waited in her own apartments, while the great machinery of church and faction worked just beyond her walls to end her, not knowing from one hour to the next whether she would be ordered to quit Versailles in disgrace before the week was out. Those were, one imagines, the longest days of her life, and the most frightening, worse even than the long ordeal of the Poissonnades, because this was not mockery, but the real and imminent prospect of the end of everything. She could not go to the king. The devout had closed around his sickbed like a wall, and to push past them would have been to confirm everything they said of her, the grasping mistress clinging to a dying man. So she stayed in her rooms among the porcelain and the unread papers, and she did the hardest thing a person of action can be asked to do, which is nothing, visibly and with composure, while her fate was decided elsewhere by people who wished her gone. She had loyal friends who came and went with news, and the news was bad, and then less bad, and then, slowly, with the king's recovery, good. But she could not know in the worst of it how it would fall out, and she had to hold her face steady before her own servants and visitors all the while, because the smallest visible crack would have been carried at once to her enemies as proof that she knew herself finished. She held. It is the through line of her life, that capacity to hold still and composed under a pressure that would have shattered most people, and it was never tested harder than in those January days, and it never served her better. She held her nerve. That, once again, is the heart of it, and it is everything. While the court wrote her off and her enemies all but measured her rooms for their own use, she did not panic, and she did not flee, because she understood one thing that the devout party in the heat of their certainty had entirely overlooked, which was that the wound was not mortal, and the king was not going to die. And as the days passed and it grew clear that Louis would recover, that the blade had gone only skin deep, that there would be no deathbed and no last confession, and no grand reconciliation with heaven after all. The towering edifice of her ruin simply dissolved into nothing. The fear passed off, and the penitence passed off along with it. The king, restored to his health and to himself, wanted his friend back at his side, wanted the comfort and the company and the steady, unflattering intelligence that he could not do without, and she returned to her place as though the crisis had never happened at all. She had survived the closest call of her entire career, not by any act or stratagem, but by the far harder discipline of holding perfectly still while everyone around her took her for finished. The unfortunate Damiens met the end that the age reserved for any man who raised a hand against the sacred person of a king, and it was a horror that I am not going to lay out before you in detail, because it was deliberately and theatrically cruel in the way that public punishment was meant to be in that century, designed above all to terrify a watching crowd into obedience, and the bare fact of it is more than enough. He was tortured and then put to death in a public square in Paris before an enormous crowd, in a manner so prolonged and so brutal that even hardened observers came away sickened to the soul, and the spectacle did its intended work of reminding all of France what the body of the king was held to be. It is a measure of how strange and how violent the life beneath all that elegance truly was, that the very same court which spent fortunes upon porcelain and soft pastoral paintings could produce, the instant it felt its sacred order threatened, a punishment dredged up whole from the darkest depths of the medieval imagination. For Pompadour, the lesson of that January was a sobering one, even in the hour of her survival. She had seen, with terrible clarity, how thin the ground was beneath her feet, how a single accident, a fall from a horse, a fever in the night, a knife in a dark courtyard, could in one instant hand her enemies the king's frightened soul, and with it her own certain destruction. She had built her entire power upon being necessary to one single mortal man, and that strategy, brilliant as it was, carried always within it this one catastrophic flaw, that the man was mortal, and that the very day he was forced to face his own death would be the day she could not save herself by any art she possessed. She went back to her rooms and back to her papers, but she went back, I think, with a colder and clearer sense than ever before of how completely alone she stood at the summit of the thing she had climbed, and of how the only security left to her was to make herself, with each passing day, a little more indispensable still, and to pray that the king lived long. The king lived. But she, who had built everything upon his living, was now the one whose life began visibly to fail. She had never been strong, you will remember, not from the very beginning, and the long, unbroken years of strain had spent whatever strength she had been given. By the opening of the 1760s, the woman who had charmed a king in a hall of mirrors was plainly, increasingly unwell, troubled by a weakness in the lungs and a labouring heart, the slow, relentless, wasting illness of the chest that the 18th century could name well enough but could do almost nothing to cure. She grew thin and then gaunt. Those who saw her in these last years, and had known her in her glory, were shaken by the change. The famous beauty worn down to something fragile and effortful, the bright eyes too large now in the narrowed face, the breath short, the colour false. She tired after the smallest exertion. A flight of stairs that she had once run up to reach the king's apartments became a labour to be measured and rested through. The cold of the great palace, which had always been her enemy, now reached into her chest and would not let go, and she coughed, and the cough did not mend, and everyone who heard it knew, in the way people did in that century, what such a cough foretold. She filled her rooms with the warmth and the beauty she had always loved. The fires kept high, the flowers brought in from the hothouses against the season, as though comfort and loveliness might hold the thing at bay a little longer, and she went on painting the healthy face over the failing one each morning, choosing the gown, applying the colour, presenting to the king and the court, the woman they expected, rather than the one the mirror showed her, because that was her discipline and her armour, and by now, very nearly her entire self. The bright living colour that the works at Sèvres had laboured to capture in their porcelain drained out of her own face, and she leaned more heavily with each passing season upon the rouge and the careful, magnificent dress that had always been for her, a kind of armour worn against the world. You should understand how hard she had fought her own body for years before this, because the fight is part of who she was. Her health had been precarious for all of her reign, and she had carried it as one more secret to be managed, one more weakness the court must never be permitted to see. There had been the recurring fevers, the headaches, the nervous exhaustion that the age vaguely called the vapours, the long stretches when she rose from her bed only by an act of pure will and painted a healthy face over an ailing one, and went out to do the day's work of being the king's bright and necessary companion. There had been, in the years when his desire was cooling, a near-desperate regimen of remedies pressed upon her, diets of truffles and celery and chocolate, that the physicians of the day believed might warm a sluggish constitution and rekindle what time was quietly extinguishing, none of which could have done the smallest good, all of which she dutifully tried, because the keeping of the king was her vocation, and she would leave no instrument of it untried. She had governed a kingdom from a body that was forever betraying her, and the wonder is not that it failed in the end, but that it carried her as far as it did. She did not stop even now. She went on with the work, the papers, the ciphered dispatches, the patient management of the king's long days and longer evenings, the endless performance of being well and being indispensable, well past the point where her failing frame could honestly sustain any of it. She had her brother near her by now, a sensible, capable man whom she had raised, with her usual sound eye for ability, to be the director of the king's buildings, so that the family of Fish now numbered among its members the official overseer of the architecture of France, and there were a few true friends, a small handful of people she had gathered to herself over the decades whom she could trust to want nothing from her but her company. Her brother is worth pausing on, because he tells you something about her that the public story leaves out. She had brought him up the ladder behind her, but she had not done it by simply handing him a high office to keep in the family. She had him educated, sent abroad to learn at first hand the art and the building and the design of Italy, so that when she made him master of the king's works, he should actually deserve the post and discharge it well, which by all accounts he did, soberly and competently, for years. It was characteristic of her. Even her nepotism had taste and judgment in it. And it bred, as everything about her bred, a particular resentment, because there is nothing the established order hates more than to watch the rules of advancement bent for an outsider, even when the outsider chosen proves worthy. The old families of France had spent centuries arranging matters so that the prizes of the kingdom, the offices and the honours and the commands, flowed to people like themselves by right of birth, and here was the financier's daughter, directing some of that flow by her own judgment, raising men she thought able, and her own kin among them, and the resentment of it ran deep and lasting. It did not matter that the men she raised were often genuinely capable. It mattered that she had no right, by the old reckoning, to be raising anyone at all. That merit chosen by an upstart was a kind of theft from those who held that only blood should choose. She lived inside that resentment all her career, and it shaped how her every act was read, so that her successes were called luck or scheming, and her family's deserved advancement was called grasping, and there was no version of her conduct, however careful, that her enemies could not turn against her. That is the condition of the outsider who climbs. The climbing itself is the unforgivable offence, and no good behaviour afterward can ever quite wash it away. And the friends were the same, chosen not for their grandeur, but for some quality of loyalty or wit or simple kindness that the rest of that calculating court could not supply. People in whose company she could let the mask slip a half-inch lower than anywhere else, but only a half-inch, even with them, and even now. That was the iron law of her existence, that there was no one, in all the thousands who surrounded her, before whom she could set the performance down entirely and rest. And as her body failed her, the keeping up of it grew heavier with each passing week. But she could not lay the performance down even for them, not entirely, not after so long, and she worked, and she sickened, and she painted over the sickening, because she understood with her clear, unsparing intelligence the one fact that governed everything, which was that the day she could no longer perform would be the day they were finally permitted to set her aside. So she performed, in the candlelight of those late winter evenings, a tired and dying woman among her flowers and her porcelain, holding a court and a king and a crumbling enterprise together by sheer accumulated habit and force of will, while the illness in her chest went quietly and patiently about its work, and in the early spring of the year 1764 the work was very nearly done. In the early spring of 1764 it became clear to everyone around her, and not least to herself, that she was dying. She was at Versailles, in the apartment she had occupied for so many years, and she was, by the strict and merciless etiquette of that place, somewhere she had no right at all to be, because Versailles was a palace in which, by an ancient and absolute rule, no one was permitted to die except a member of the royal family itself. A dying courtier, however eminent, was supposed to be removed, carried away to breathe their last somewhere else, so that the sacred precincts of the king's own house should never be touched and polluted by the common death of a subject. That she was allowed to remain, to die within the palace walls, in rooms lying beside the king's own, was an extraordinary breaking of that rule, and the watching court understood at once what it signified. It was a last and unmistakable declaration of what she had been to him, that the King of France would bend even the iron laws governing death itself, rather than turn his friend out of doors to die among strangers. The king came to her in those final days, which was in itself a thing without precedent, a sovereign at the deathbed of a woman who was neither his wife nor his kin, and the court saw it, and understood. Think of what those visits meant, set against everything we have seen of how that court worked. A king whose every step was watched and weighed, who could not attend her funeral, who was bound hand and foot by an etiquette that forbade him even to mourn her in public, nonetheless went openly to sit beside the bed of his dying friend, in defiance of all the careful rules that said a commoner's death was no fit business for the sacred person of the monarch. He had loved her in the worn and complicated way of two people who have grown old in each other's company, and the love had long since stopped being the kind that scandalized the priests and become something quieter and more durable, the bond of the one human being who knew him entirely and asked nothing of the king in him, only of the man. And now she was leaving, and he was there beside her while she did, because for once, at the very end, what he wanted and what the rules allowed fell briefly together. She, for her part, met death as she had met everything else, dressed and composed and in command of the scene, sparing him as much as she could, keeping her wit and her dignity intact, so that the last thing he carried from her would not be a horror, but a woman still, recognizably, herself. They had been together nearly 20 years. They were saying goodbye. And then the priest came. And then, near the very end, he returned, as he always did at last, to do the offices of the church for the dying. And there occurred the small, quiet exchange that has outlived nearly everything else about her, the few words by which she is perhaps most remembered of all. She had even now, even within sight of her last hour, called for her rouge, had it brought to her, and applied a little colour to a face that had once charmed the most powerful man in Europe, because she would meet whatever was coming exactly as she had met everything else in her life, composed, finished, in perfect command of how she appeared to the world. And as the priest, his work concluded, made to take his leave of the room, she is said to have spoken to him with that same light, unbroken wit she had carried with her all her days, telling him to wait one moment longer, that they would go away together. "Wait, Monsieur le Curé, we shall leave together." There is so much of her character folded into that one small sentence that it is worth holding it to the light. The wit, first, the lightness, the refusal to be solemn even at the threshold of death, the same quick grace that had charmed a king and disarmed a court, turned now at the end upon the grimmest moment a person faces. The composure, the absolute command of the scene, arranging even her own dying so that the priest should not be inconvenienced, and the watchers should not be distressed, and she herself should not be caught undone, and the courtesy, that instinctive consideration for the person in front of her, the priest kept waiting, addressed kindly, included in the moment, that had been her gift all her life, and did not desert her at its end. She had spent her existence managing how she appeared, controlling the surface she presented to the world, performing without interval before the cruelest audience on earth, and here, in her last conscious hour, she gave the performance its final flawless note, choosing to leave the stage not as a frightened, dying woman, but as herself, composed and gracious and faintly amused, in perfect command to the curtain. It was the final act she could control, and she controlled it, and then she let it go. Whether the words fell out in precisely that shape, we cannot ever be quite certain, the way we can never be entirely sure of any last words, spoken low in a sick room and remembered afterward by people who needed them to be perfect. But they are so entirely in character, so exactly the kind of thing she would have said, that this alone is why they have lasted. The dying woman keeping her composure and her humour intact right up to the very threshold, refusing even death the small satisfaction of catching her unprepared and undone. She died on the 15th of April, in the year 1764. She was 42 years old. The girl from the tall, narrow house above the rain-slick Paris street, the child the fortune-teller had marked out for the heart of a king, the woman France had loved and hated and mocked and feared and could not, for 19 years, contrive to ignore, was gone, and the candle-lit world she had built so painstakingly around herself, the porcelain and the paintings and the private suppers and the soft pink rooms at the top of the hidden stair, went quiet around her at last, the way a stage goes quiet when the one performer who held it all together has finally, after the longest run anyone could remember, walked off into the dark. Now I want to take you to a window, because the most affecting moment in all of this long story is not her death itself, but what happened the day after it, and it belongs fittingly to the king. By the same iron etiquette that had so nearly denied her even a death within the palace, Louis could not attend her funeral. She was not royal, and a king of France did not walk behind the coffin of a marquise, however dear she had been to him, through the public streets of his kingdom, so he could not go with her. He could not stand at her graveside, could not be seen to mourn her as a man mourns the one person who has been the closest companion of his adult life, because the rules that governed each hour of his existence did not allow it. And even kings, it turns out, are prisoners of the very world they sit enthroned at the top of her body, was carried away from Versailles in the ordinary way, to be buried in Paris beside the mother and the daughter she had lost, and the king of all France was left behind in his vast palace, able to do precisely nothing. What he did was go to a window. The day she was taken from Versailles was wet and cold and grey, a hard April day with the rain coming straight down across the great empty courtyards, and Louis XV stood at a window of the palace and watched the small procession carry her away into the weather. He stood there, they say, in silence, watching the coffin go, until it had passed entirely out of his sight along the road that led to Paris, and the rain came down upon it all of the way. And then he is said to have spoken, half to himself, a few small words about the weather, about what a poor day it was that the Marquise had drawn for her last journey, that she would not have good weather for it now. That was all. A remark about the rain, but everyone who heard it understood perfectly well what lay beneath it, that the most powerful man in Europe was standing helpless at a pane of glass, unable to follow the one person he had most wanted near him for 19 years, reduced to remarking on the rain because the rain was the only grief that the rules of his world would permit him to show. It is one of the most quietly devastating images all of the 18th century has left to us. The king at the glass, the coffin in the wet, the careful, almost casual little sentence about the weather, covering over a loss he was forbidden even to name aloud. And there is a terrible justice in it when you set it against the rest of their story. For 19 years she had given everything she had to the task of easing this man's loneliness, of making sure he was never, in the hours that mattered, left alone with the grey weight inside him. And now she was the one being carried away into the rain, and he was the one left standing alone at the glass, with no one to ease his loneliness now, because the only person who had ever truly known how was the one in the coffin. He would live another decade, and take other women, and find no one to replace her, and die at last, unloved and unmourned by a people who had come to despise him, and one wonders whether, in those last years, he ever stood again at that window and remembered the wet April morning when the one companion of his life had gone down the Paris road without him. She had taught him to need her, and then she had gone, and left him with the need and nothing to fill it. That was the last and perhaps the cruelest consequence of her great achievement. She had made herself irreplaceable, and then she had been taken, and irreplaceable is only another word for a wound that does not close. She was buried at a convent in Paris, among the few she had truly loved, her mother and her lost Alexandrine, and the world she had dominated for 2 decades went on without her, the way worlds always do, and largely at first it went on misremembering her, the way worlds do that too. For the rest of the 18th century, and well on into the centuries that followed, she was made the easy villain of the piece, the extravagant favourite who had beggared France and lost its empire, and danced and bought porcelain while the foundations rotted unseen beneath the floor. The cruel verses outlived her. The blame for the lost war outlived her. The image of the painted mistress draining the treasury for her pink and her palaces became one of the standing accusations laid against the doomed order of the old regime, and when that order fell in fire and blood, a single generation after her death, her name was among the ones the revolutionaries spat into the gutter. It has taken patient work across 2 long centuries to recover the actual woman from beneath all of that, and she is well worth the recovering, which is the reason you and I have spent this evening together with her. The recovery has come slowly, and from unlikely directions. It came from the historians who actually counted the cost of her famous extravagance, and found that a great deal of it had gone not on personal indulgence, but on the works and the manufactures and the artists that made France the envy of Europe. It came from the art lovers who stood before the buildings she raised, and the porcelain she willed into being, and asked who had had the eye and the will to make such things, and found her name behind them. It came from those who read the letters and the memoirs of the people who actually knew her, and met there not the painted monster of the verses, but a woman of wit and warmth and formidable intelligence, loyal to her friends, tender to her daughter, courteous even to her enemies, carrying a weight of strain and grief and ill health that would have broken most people, and carrying it with a grace that almost no one around her ever saw past. The legend had made her a symbol, and symbols are convenient and false. The truth restores her to herself, which is a harder and a finer thing, a particular human being who lived a particular impossible life and met it, from first to last, with more courage and more skill than her century was ever willing to grant her. And so we give it to her now, 260 years too late, the only thing a story can give anyone, which is to be seen plainly, as she was before we let her rest. The truth is more interesting than the legend, the way the truth so very nearly always is. She was not the cause of France's disasters, though she shared honestly in the decisions that brought some of them on. She was something far rarer and more remarkable than a villain. She was a person of genuine and serious gifts who rose against every rule and wall her world could set in her way, from a counting house to the very summit of a kingdom, and who used the strange power she had seized not merely to survive at that summit, but to build, to protect beauty, and to protect dangerous ideas, to leave behind her squares and palaces, and a refinement of national taste that France wears to this day, and to shelter the perilous new thinking of her century at the precise moment the old powers most wanted it crushed. She was lonely, and she was grieving, and she was always, until the very last hour of her life, performing, and underneath all the performance there was a clever, disciplined, frightened, deeply human woman who was never once, in all her glittering years, permitted simply to set the performance down and rest. The little queen the fortune-teller had promised, the reign that was only ever a reign over the heart of a single king, and that cost her, to hold it for as long as she did, very nearly everything she had to give. So let the candles of Versailles burn down low now, let the rain fall on the great courtyards, and let the king turn away from his window. Let the soft pink rooms go dark and quiet, the porcelain gleaming faintly in the failing light, the state papers left for once unread upon the writing table, and let the vast glittering machine she ran for 20 years wind gently down into stillness, the way your own evening is winding down now around you in the dark. She has had her 2 centuries of being misunderstood. She is allowed, in the small and private hour that closes each life, to be simply herself again, the girl in the room above the Paris street, with the fire burning low and the rain on the shutters, sleep at last with nothing left in all the world that she has to perform. If you have stayed with me all the way to here, through her long life and into its quiet ending, then thank you for keeping me company through the few hours we have spent together. I hope she stays with you a little while, the real woman underneath the legend, the next time you happen to see her face on a print, or hear her name said carelessly by someone who only knows the story they were handed. If these long evenings in other centuries are something you would like to find your way back to, you are welcome to subscribe, and another life, another era, another candlelit world will be waiting whenever you want it. There is no hurry. There never is here. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.